Hey there, sleepyheads. Tonight's tale isn't about knights or castles. It isn't about battles or crowns. It's about something far closer to home, the kitchens, hearths, and hidden corners where medieval women spent their days. We're slipping behind the cottage door into a world where secrets weren't written in ink but in bread dough, firewood, and whispered bargains. The life of a medieval housewife was filled with work, yes, but also with choices and risks that outsiders rarely saw. Some of those choices kept families alive. Others could invite danger. No one kept diaries about how they stretched a pot of stew to last the week or how they bartered with neighbours in secret. But these hidden actions mattered. They shaped whether children grew, whether households thrived, and sometimes whether a woman herself fell under suspicion. Because in a society where privacy was rare and gossip was powerful, even an ordinary habit could be branded as strange, sinful, or worse. What you'll hear tonight isn't glamorous. There are no silks, no feasts, no fairy tale kitchens, just smoke-dimmed rafters, worn wooden spoons, and the weight of responsibility on a woman's shoulders. But in those quiet spaces, housewives carried dangerous secrets of survival, of defiance, and sometimes of desperation. Before we step into that hidden world, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these slow, quiet rambles into the overlooked corners of history. If you're new here, welcome. This is the village's back room, where the stories are simple, soft, and sometimes a little unsettling. And if your eyelids are already heavy, don't worry. These women's stories will wait. They've been waiting for centuries, folded into linen, simmered in soup, and tucked into the shadows of half-forgotten kitchens. Now, before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? What time of evening is it for you? And what little corner of the world are you curled up in? Maybe with tea, maybe with a blanket, maybe just with the quiet hum of the night. Take a deep breath in and let it go. Let the hush fall over you like a door closing gently. Because behind that door, in the dim glow of the hearth, the story of the medieval housewife begins. In medieval Europe, much of the story of women, especially housewives, was lived in spaces that rarely left a written trace. The grand chronicles, sermons, and court documents speak often of kings, wars, and the affairs of nobles. But the day-to-day life of a married peasant woman or townswoman was mostly invisible to the record. Yet it was precisely behind doors and within the walls of cottages, manors, and cramped townhouses that much of medieval society was sustained. These private spaces hid work, choices, and negotiations that could determine the survival of a household, even though they were rarely acknowledged in public. Housewives operated in an environment where domestic duties and social expectations were tightly bound together. A woman's role was defined in law and religion as one of obedience and service, primarily to her husband, but the practice of everyday life revealed far more complexity. Inside the home, where men's oversight was not always constant, housewives exercised authority in ways that would not have been tolerated in the marketplace or churchyard. They made decisions about food storage, firewood, clothing, and care for children. These decisions shaped not only family well-being, but also community health, since disease, hunger, or disorder in one household could ripple outward. Much of this labour was invisible because it was repetitive, mundane, and uncelebrated. Housewives swept dirt floors, hauled water from streams, and scrubbed cooking pots until they shone with sand and ash. They spun wool or flax, patched garments, and prepared meals that had to stretch through lean seasons. Many also tended small gardens for vegetables and herbs, which served both as food and medicine. These tasks seem ordinary, but they were the foundation of survival in an era when famine and plague were never far away. The smallest error, a spoiled batch of ale, a poorly stored sack of grain, a fire that smouldered out too soon, could tip a family into crisis. Privacy played a crucial role in how this work unfolded. The medieval household was not always a place of isolation. Many families lived communally, sometimes with servants, apprentices, or extended kin. Still, the walls of the home created boundaries. Tasks carried out inside could be shielded from the eyes of neighbours and officials. A woman could hide her methods for stretching food supplies, keep quiet about a child's illness until it passed, or manage a disagreement with her husband in private rather than in the public square. In this sense, secrecy was not always a matter of scandal, but of practical necessity. The medieval legal system also contributed to the silence around housewives' lives. Most minor disputes or incidents that arose within the home were never reported unless they spilled into public disorder or criminal accusations. If a quarrel between husband and wife remained behind closed doors, it usually escaped official notice. Similarly, much of the economy of a household, small-scale brewing, baking or cloth-making, was informal. Women might sell surpluses or barter with neighbours without entering the formal market, keeping these exchanges hidden from the regulations and taxes that governed official trade. Religious teaching reinforced the notion that the home was a woman's proper sphere, yet it also demanded that she exercise vigilance. Preachers urged wives to maintain order, modesty and moral discipline inside their houses. While this language placed them under the authority of husbands, it also granted them a paradoxical responsibility. If the household fell into disarray, the wife was often blamed, not the man. This expectation meant that many women developed quiet systems of management and discipline that were never discussed publicly. Archaeological evidence offers glimpses of this private world. Excavations of medieval homes reveal soot-darkened walls, broken pottery, combs for lice, and traces of herbs once scattered across floors. These fragments speak of routines that rarely made it into the records: cleaning, fumigating, repairing, and cooking. They also hint at the constant balancing act housewives performed, keeping a household livable in conditions that outsiders might have found unbearable. Daily life beyond the village eye, then, was not idle or secondary. It was a space of hidden labour, quiet authority, and constant negotiation. What outsiders saw, a tidy yard, children clothed, smoke rising from a hearth, was the product of countless tasks carried out in private. For medieval housewives, the home was both a site of restriction and of subtle control. Within its walls, they managed more than chores, they managed survival itself. And yet, what remained unseen could also be misunderstood or even mistrusted. This hidden world, though ordinary, carried with it the seeds of suspicion. As we move to the next theme, the importance of privacy in cramped homes, it becomes clear that what women concealed, whether intentionally or not, could just as easily be read as secretiveness or danger by the wider community. Privacy is something modern households often take for granted: a closed door, a separate bedroom, or even the chance to be alone for a few minutes. In the medieval household, especially among peasants and poorer townsfolk, privacy was a luxury that scarcely existed. Most families lived in single-room dwellings, where cooking, eating, sleeping and working all took place in the same space. This lack of separation shaped daily life in ways that can be difficult for us to imagine today. One of the most immediate consequences was that a family's entire life was on display to itself. Children grew up watching their parents manage disputes, prepare food, and care for infants without the divisions of space that modern households create. Beds, when they existed, were often shared by multiple family members, sometimes including servants or apprentices. Curtains might be used to divide a sleeping space or give a nursing mother a little distance, but for the most part there was little opportunity for true seclusion. This arrangement meant that medieval notions of privacy were defined differently. Privacy was not about shutting a door or retreating to a personal room, but about carving out moments of discretion within a communal setting. A whispered conversation at the edge of the field, a quiet walk to fetch water, or even turning one's back while changing clothes might be the only ways to create personal space. Privacy, in this sense, was situational rather than structural. At the same time, the lack of private space reinforced the importance of reputation and behaviour. Because so much of life unfolded in shared view, both within the household and in the broader community, housewives in particular had little room to hide their choices. How she managed food, how she handled quarrels, even how often she kept her home swept could all become the subject of gossip. With neighbours living close and sound carrying easily through thin walls or open shutters, secrecy was hard to maintain. Yet the need for discretion was real. A housewife might wish to conceal a private prayer, a personal health concern, or a small act of defiance, such as setting aside food for a visiting relative instead of following her husband's wishes. In such cases, privacy often depended on trust, on knowing which family members or neighbours could be relied upon to keep quiet. The absence of physical barriers made secrecy a matter of social strategy rather than architectural design. Even in wealthier households where multiple rooms or separate chambers existed, privacy was still not absolute. Servants, apprentices and extended kin often lived under the same roof, and their presence meant that a lady of the house was rarely alone. Letters, diaries, or private reflections were rare for women, not only because literacy was limited, but also because anything written down might easily be discovered. Privacy, therefore, was as much about navigating relationships as it was about physical space. Religious expectations further complicated the question of privacy. Confession to a priest was one of the few sanctioned private acts, but even this was bounded by the community's awareness. Everyone knew who went to confession and when. Within the household, acts of devotion, such as saying prayers or reading scripture, could be personal, but rarely completely hidden. A woman who sought solitude for spiritual reasons might be questioned, or even suspected of unorthodox behaviour if she spent too much time apart. The absence of privacy also shaped how disputes unfolded. Arguments between spouses, tensions between in-laws, or even punishments of children often played out before the entire household. This public exposure could heighten shame, but also acted as a form of accountability since few disagreements were ever truly invisible. It also meant that gossip could spread quickly. An overheard quarrel, a poorly hidden injury, or a badly kept household secret could fuel rumours that damaged reputations. For the medieval housewife, then, the struggle for privacy was both practical and social. On one hand, she had to manage the realities of a crowded living space where moments of solitude were fleeting. On the other, she had to protect her reputation in a society that prized conformity and punished suspicion. The combination made discretion one of the most valuable skills a woman could possess. What emerges from this picture is a very different understanding of the household compared to today. Privacy was not expected, and so people adapted. Families learned to live in each other's company constantly, to accept shared sleeping and working spaces, and to rely on silence or tact rather than walls to create boundaries. For housewives, those skills were part of survival, because in a world where everyone could see and hear, the ability to keep a secret often determined whether it remained safe. If privacy in the medieval household was scarce, so too was open acknowledgement of all the work that women performed. Much of a housewife's labour was visible: cooking over the hearth, scrubbing clothing at the stream, sweeping floors, or preparing food for storage. But behind these daily routine chores were a host of additional duties that were rarely written down, seldom praised, and almost never openly discussed. These hidden responsibilities were central to the survival of the household, yet they remained largely invisible in the records left to us. One of the most significant unspoken duties was managing the household's reputation. While husbands might appear as the official heads of families, it was often wives who ensured that neighbours, kin and church officials viewed the household favourably. This meant controlling gossip, smoothing over quarrels and maintaining appearances, even when resources were scarce. A clean front step, orderly linens hung to dry, or a respectful exchange at market could go a long way towards shielding a family from criticism. This work was subtle, but its impact was enormous. Another hidden duty was the careful management of food reserves. Households in the Middle Ages, especially those of peasants, lived close to the margins. A poor harvest, spoiled storage, or unexpected guest could tip the balance toward hunger. Housewives had to quietly stretch supplies without necessarily admitting to their husbands or neighbours how precarious the situation had become. Mixing cheaper grains into bread, disguising aging meat with heavy spices, or portioning meals unequally within the family were decisions often left unspoken. A husband might assume the pot simply contained less food that day, without realising his wife had eaten little so that he and the children could eat more. Health management was another domain of hidden responsibility. Women were often the first to notice illness in children or subtle signs of weakness in spouses. They prepared herbal remedies, adjusted diets, or sought advice from other women in confidence before deciding whether to involve a physician. whose services were costly and often unhelpful. In many cases, women acted as quiet caregivers, applying knowledge passed down orally from mother to daughter. These remedies were rarely recorded in writing and often went unrecognised in official accounts, yet they formed the backbone of household health. Discretion also extended to matters of fertility and childbirth. Conversations about menstruation, miscarriages, or efforts to avoid conception were seldom held openly, yet women had their own shared networks of knowledge. Midwives and experienced mothers passed along information in whispers, often outside the earshot of men. A housewife might discreetly brew an herbal tea to regulate her cycle, or quietly seek a midwife's advice on how to recover after a miscarriage. These duties carried both risk and importance, yet they remained unacknowledged in official chronicles. Money management, too, often required secrecy. While men were generally considered the economic heads of households, women frequently handled the practical flow of small coins. They bargained at markets, extended or received credit, and sometimes set aside tiny amounts from sales of eggs, cheese, or cloth they had produced. These hidden savings could make the difference during lean months or help fund small but essential purchases. It was not unusual for a wife to quietly maintain a reserve without her husband's knowledge, not as a betrayal, but as a form of protection for the family against uncertainty. Social obligations formed another layer of unspoken work. A housewife was expected to maintain ties with neighbours, kin, and parish life, often by quietly offering small acts of generosity. Lending a measure of grain, assisting in childbirth, or providing a cup of ale during gatherings reinforced bonds of trust. These gestures were rarely recorded, but they built the social fabric that households depended upon in times of need. Failure to perform them could result in gossip or exclusion, so women carried the hidden responsibility of ensuring their families remained integrated within the community. All of this unspoken labour reinforced a broader reality. Housewives were expected to manage a complex system of survival without drawing undue attention to their efforts. Their duties were not only physical, but also social, emotional, and economic. Yet the cultural expectation was that much of this would be invisible, taken for granted rather than recognised as essential work. This invisibility has shaped how history remembers them. Official documents, court records, church accounts, tax rolls rarely detail the quiet decisions made in kitchens, wells, or during market exchanges. Chronicles praised knights and lords, sometimes mentioning noblewomen, but peasant housewives remained absent when they failed in their duties. Success meant silence, failure meant exposure. Thus, when we speak of the hidden duties of medieval housewives, we are speaking of the very glue that held families together. They managed shortages without complaint, tended to illnesses without recognition, and protected reputations without praise. These tasks were unspoken, not because they were unimportant, but because they were expected. In the cramped and watchful world of the medieval household, silence was both a necessity and a form of survival. Silence was one part of a housewife's world, but secrecy went even further. It was not simply about leaving certain labours unspoken. It was about deliberately keeping knowledge, decisions, or actions concealed in order to protect the household. In a society where the balance between survival and ruin could shift suddenly, secrecy became a practical tool, one that allowed women to shield their families, maintain some control over their environment, and avoid unwanted interference from neighbours, clergy, or even their own husbands. Food shortages provide a clear example. A wife might quietly set aside a hidden store of flour, dried beans, or salted fish, tucking them away in a chest or beneath a floorboard. These reserves were not always openly acknowledged because to reveal them could invite demands from relatives, expectations from neighbours, or criticism from a husband who considered such secrecy unnecessary. Yet, when a lean season arrived or when guests appeared unexpectedly, that small hidden supply could mean the difference between hunger and sufficiency. Secrecy allowed her to stretch resources without losing face or surrendering control. Secrecy also played a role in health and healing. Remedies drawn from herbs, roots, or animal products often carried associations with folk belief or superstition. If spoken of too openly, they could draw suspicion from priests or neighbours who worried about sorcery or unorthodox practices. Thus, a housewife might keep her remedies private, using them only within her household, or sharing them discreetly with trusted women. A poultice for a fever, an infusion for childbirth pains, or an herbal concoction to regulate fertility might never be admitted to outsiders. The secrecy was not only about protection from authorities, but also about safeguarding knowledge that was too valuable to be squandered or misused. Marital relationships added another layer of secrecy. Husbands were considered legal and social heads of the household, but that did not mean they controlled every detail of family life. A wife might quietly redirect money, deciding not to tell her husband that she had bartered some eggs for a piece of cloth, or that she had tucked away a small coin given to her in exchange for spinning yarn. These secret reserves gave her leverage, not for rebellion, but for stability. Should a child fall ill or a tax collector demand payment, she could act without waiting for her husband's permission or without confessing that she had prepared for such a possibility. Secrecy extended to managing reputation as well. Medieval society was deeply attuned to gossip, and accusations could damage a family's standing quickly. If a daughter was caught speaking with a young man, or if an indiscretion occurred within the home, it was often the housewife's responsibility to ensure the matter did not spread. Silence, cover stories, and quiet negotiations with neighbours helped protect reputations. In a world where dishonour could carry legal and economic consequences, secrecy became a defensive tool as important as any lock on a chest. Women also used secrecy to preserve networks of female solidarity. Midwives, healers, and older women passed down knowledge in whispers, away from men and priests. These networks allowed women to manage childbirth, fertility, and illness without ceding total control to the church or medical authorities. Keeping such information within women's circles was an act of survival, ensuring that knowledge continued despite social pressures to silence it. The secrecy was protective, both of the individuals involved and of the continuity of women's expertise. At the same time, secrecy had its risks. Hidden food supplies could be discovered and spark anger. Remedies whispered from mother to daughter could be denounced as witchcraft. A coin set aside without a husband's knowledge might be seen as deceit. Yet the fact that so many women practiced secrecy despite these dangers shows how necessary it was. Without it, households would have been even more vulnerable to famine, illness, and social judgment. The silence of history itself mirrors this secrecy. Few medieval records mention the small caches of food, the hidden coins, or the whispered remedies. Court cases sometimes reveal them, but only when secrecy failed, when someone was accused, caught, or exposed. Otherwise, these acts went unnoticed, precisely because they were meant to. What survives in documents is often the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it lay countless acts of quiet concealment that kept families afloat. For medieval housewives, secrecy was not rebellion against their roles, but an extension of them. To manage a household effectively often meant deciding what to reveal and what to hide. It was a way of controlling uncertainty in a world filled with scarcity, surveillance, and judgment. By holding back knowledge, stashing away resources, or guarding reputations, they created breathing room within tight constraints. Thus, secrecy was not an indulgence, it was a necessity. It allowed women to operate with a degree of autonomy in a society that limited their authority. It kept households stable in the face of shortages and crises. And though it rarely left traces in chronicles or sermons, secrecy shaped the daily reality of countless families. For many medieval housewives, survival itself depended on what could be kept hidden. If secrecy helped housewives protect their families, nowhere was it more evident than in the realm of remedies and herbs. The line between accepted household medicine and forbidden knowledge was thin in the Middle Ages, and women often walked it daily. Herbal cures, charms, and treatments were part of ordinary domestic management, yet they were also viewed with suspicion. A woman who knew too much, or who used her knowledge too effectively, could be accused of stepping outside her proper role, sometimes even of practicing witchcraft. Herbal remedies formed the core of medieval household healthcare. Few families had access to physicians, and even fewer could afford their treatments. Instead, the responsibility for tending to illness fell on women within the home. They learned to brew teas for stomach troubles, to apply poultices for fevers, and to mix ointments for wounds. Much of this knowledge was inherited, passed down from mothers and grandmothers, or shared among neighbours. A sprig of sage, a bundle of chamomile, a few cloves of garlic. These were not exotic or rare, but part of the everyday household arsenal. Yet the church and local authorities kept a close watch on such practices. Remedies that aligned with accepted medical theory, based on the four humours and sanctioned by learned men, were tolerated, but cures that drew on folk traditions, charms, or unorthodox methods could easily fall under suspicion. For example, an herbal infusion, whispered over with a short rhyme or blessing, might be seen as harmless in one village and dangerous in another. A poultice made of herbs gathered at dawn or under a specific moon could attract accusations of sorcery if someone wished to see it that way. This ambiguity meant that housewives often cloaked their remedies in silence. They might describe a treatment in simple practical terms to outsiders, leaving out the rituals or inherited wisdom that accompanied it. When a child's fever broke, neighbours might marvel at a mother's skill, but she would rarely explain the full mixture of plants or the words spoken over the bowl. To do so risked scrutiny. To keep quiet allowed her to protect both her family and herself. Some herbs carried reputations that made them particularly controversial. Rue, pennyroyal and tansy were well known as ingredients in remedies for women's health, easing menstrual pains or regulating fertility. Because of their connection to reproduction, these herbs were especially sensitive subjects. Church authorities discouraged their use, seeing them as interfering with divine will, yet women relied on them all the same, often in secret. A bundle of pennyroyal hung discreetly in a kitchen might be dismissed as seasoning, but its true purpose was known only to those who needed it. The tension between approved medicine and hidden practice was also tied to authority. Learned physicians, nearly all men, were trained in universities and grounded their work in Latin texts. Housewives, by contrast, relied on experience, observation, and inherited knowledge. To admit that their cures often worked as well as or better than expensive professional treatments was to acknowledge a form of expertise outside official structures. That was threatening to the hierarchy of knowledge. Thus, what women practiced at the hearth was both indispensable and suspect. The risk of exposure was not imagined. Medieval court records reveal accusations against women who were believed to have overstepped in their use of remedies. Sometimes these cases began with gratitude, a cure that worked when others had failed. But if a patient later died, or if neighbours grew envious, the same woman could be branded dangerous. A healer once praised for her skills might suddenly be accused of witchcraft or malpractice. The shift could be swift and the consequences severe. Despite the risks, herbal knowledge continued to circulate among women, guarded carefully. Recipes were copied into household books when families were wealthy enough to keep them. In humbler homes, they were memorized, recited, and reinforced through practice. A girl watching her mother crush herbs for a salve absorbed the lesson long before she had the responsibility of managing her own household. In this way, remedies endured across generations, despite the suspicion they attracted. The secrecy that housewives cultivated was therefore not only about protecting resources or reputation, but about protecting knowledge itself. To admit too openly what one knew was to risk censure. To keep silent was to ensure that these skills could be used when they were needed most. Survival depended not just on having the herbs, but on knowing when and with whom to share their use. In this way, medieval women walked a fine line. Their remedies were central to family survival, but they were also potential sources of accusation. Herbs could heal, but they could also condemn. And so, as with many parts of a housewife's hidden world, knowledge itself became dangerous, too vital to give up, too risky to display openly. The uneasy place of herbal knowledge in medieval society becomes even clearer when we look at how closely healing and natural remedies overlapped. For most people, the two were nearly inseparable. A housewife reaching for dried sage to ease a cough was not thinking in terms of folk medicine versus professional medicine. To her, the herb was simply the most practical and accessible treatment at hand. The idea that healing could be separated from natural remedies was more a product of university-trained physicians who tried to draw boundaries around their own authority than of the households who lived with illness daily. In practice, natural remedies made up the bulk of medieval healthcare. Physicians were few, expensive, and often inaccessible to ordinary villagers. Even monasteries and convents, which served as centres of care, relied heavily on gardens filled with medicinal plants. Monastic herbals, texts describing the uses of plants, were copied, circulated, and sometimes adapted for household use. Women who kept a small garden behind their cottage were, in effect, continuing the same traditions that monks and nuns practiced within cloisters. Both relied on observation, trial and error, and inherited knowledge of plants. At the same time, remedies were often blended with ritual or spiritual elements, blurring the lines between healing and faith. A poultice for a wound might be made of comfrey and honey, but a prayer or charm could be spoken as it was applied. From the healer's perspective, there was no contradiction. The plants helped the body, while the words helped the spirit. But to suspicious eyes, especially those of clergy or local officials, this overlap could look like superstition or even sorcery. The very normality of mixing practical and spiritual remedies is what made it so vulnerable to accusation. Certain remedies highlight this overlap well. Honey, for example, was widely used for its antibacterial properties, though medieval people did not frame it in modern scientific terms. Instead, they spoke of its ability to draw out corruption from wounds. Garlic was another plant that straddled the line between medicine and superstition. It was used to treat digestive complaints and respiratory issues, but it was also hung at doorways to ward off evil. A clove of garlic in a pot might be a remedy. The same clove over a threshold might be dismissed as superstition. Yet to those who used it, the difference mattered less than the result. This overlap extended to childbirth, one of the most dangerous and critical events in a medieval household. Midwives often employed herbs such as pennyroyal, sage or rue to ease labour pains or manage complications. But they also used prayers, charms and holy water, believing that spiritual protection was as important as physical aid. Women rarely separated these spheres. Healing was holistic, drawing on whatever resources were available, whether physical, natural or divine. For those outside the process, however, the blend of natural and ritual elements often seemed suspicious. The same remedies that saved lives could, under different circumstances, be interpreted as dangerous meddling. The way remedies circulated also reflected their blurred nature. Recipes passed from household to household might include both measurable ingredients, a handful of sage leaves, a spoon of honey, and instructions that were less tangible, gathered at dawn, spoken over 3 times. To later observers, these instructions looked unscientific, but to medieval households they were simply part of ensuring a remedy's effectiveness. Knowledge was not about clinical separation, but about combining every tool available. It is important to note that even professional medicine overlapped with natural remedies. Physicians prescribed herbs extensively, often using the same plants women gathered from their gardens. The difference lay in how those herbs were explained. A physician might describe sage as balancing the humours, while a housewife might say it soothed a cough. The substance was the same, only the framework differed. This shows how artificial the division between household medicine and learned medicine really was. Both relied on the natural world, but one clothed its remedies in scholarly language, while the other embedded them in everyday life. The overlap also created a precarious situation for women. When remedies worked, they earned respect and gratitude. Neighbours might quietly rely on the housewife who could heal a festering cut or calm a persistent fever. But when illness lingered or worsened, the same remedies could be reinterpreted as harmful. If a child died despite being treated with herbs, suspicion could quickly fall on the woman who prepared them. Success bred trust, failure bred risk. The blurred line between healing and harming was never far from people's minds. Ultimately, the overlap of healing and natural remedies was less a matter of choice than of necessity. In a world where disease was constant and medical help scarce, households could not afford to dismiss the knowledge embedded in herbs and remedies. Women carried this responsibility, managing the daily balance of health through the tools at hand. The fact that their remedies combined the natural and the spiritual was not a flaw, but a reflection of how medieval people understood the world. Nature, faith, and healing were threads in the same cloth, and to pull one away would have unravelled the whole. It was this very interweaving, the natural with the spiritual, the domestic with the dangerous, that gave household medicine both its strength and its peril. The remedies of the home were indispensable, but because they sat at the overlap of healing and mystery, they were always vulnerable to suspicion. The fragile balance of household medicine relied not just on plants, but on memory. Remedies rarely existed in books or written notes within peasant homes. They survived instead through words spoken in kitchens, gardens, and fields. Women learned what to gather, when to gather it, and how to prepare it from mothers, aunts, or grandmothers. The knowledge was deeply personal, embedded in family traditions, and often transmitted in moments that seemed unremarkable, while cooking, while tending to a sick child, or while working together at the hearth. What made this knowledge powerful was also what made it precarious. It existed primarily in the memories of women and the fragile web of oral tradition. A daughter might learn, for example, that certain leaves should be picked at dawn, while the dew still clung to them, because that was when they were believed to be most potent. She might be told that rosemary steeped in wine could ease a headache, or that crushed plantain leaves would soothe an insect bite. These instructions were rarely written down, partly because literacy was limited, and partly because the knowledge was considered practical, not scholarly. Writing it down would have transformed it into something more public, which was not always safe. Whispering recipes within the family kept them in trusted hands. This method of transmission meant remedies were never entirely uniform. A recipe for a cough syrup might be remembered one way in one household and slightly differently in another. Variations arose depending on what plants grew locally, what could be afforded, and what ingredients were available in a given season. Over generations, these differences accumulated, creating a patchwork of remedies that looked similar but carried local adaptations. What was shared across all of them, however, was the act of women passing knowledge to each other in spaces largely invisible to men and outsiders. The secrecy of these exchanges had practical reasons. Remedies were not always viewed neutrally by neighbours or authorities. As the church tried to assert control over what counted as legitimate healing, women had to be careful about how openly they shared their recipes. Too much success might invite accusations of meddling with forbidden powers, while too much openness risked having their knowledge taken and repackaged by others. Keeping recipes within the family created a protective boundary. The whispered transmission was as much about guarding a reputation as it was about guarding the effectiveness of the remedy. The rhythm of household life ensured that daughters learned remedies gradually. Unlike formal training, which presented knowledge in systematic lessons, domestic learning was incremental. A mother might demonstrate how to mix honey with crushed garlic when a child developed a cough. Months later, she might show how to boil nettles to create a tonic for spring weakness. The learning was practical, responding to real needs as they arose. By the time a daughter grew into adulthood, she had absorbed dozens of such recipes, often without realizing she had been apprenticed all along. These whispered exchanges also highlight the gendered nature of medical knowledge. Men might study medicine in universities or monasteries, but women preserved the everyday healing traditions that actually kept most households alive. This gave women a quiet authority within their homes, even in societies that denied them formal power. A housewife who knew which herbs eased childbirth or how to prepare a salve for burns commanded respect, whether or not her knowledge was officially sanctioned. Yet this authority remained unacknowledged, living in the background of daily life, passed along quietly from one generation of women to the next. The fragility of this oral tradition also meant that knowledge could be lost quickly. If a woman died young, or if a family line was broken by war, famine, or plague, entire strands of remedies could vanish. This vulnerability was one reason monasteries tried to record remedies in writing. but what they preserved often represented only a fraction of the practices circulating in peasant households. The most effective or trusted remedies might never make it into a manuscript at all, because they stayed within families, whispered in kitchens rather than inked onto parchment. At the same time, the act of whispering recipes imbued them with a kind of intimacy that writing could not replicate. Passing remedies by word of mouth kept them rooted in relationships. The memory of a grandmother's voice or the repeated motions of a mother's hands reinforced the trust placed in the recipe. It was not just a set of instructions, it was an inheritance, linking women across generations through shared responsibility for the health of their families. In this way, recipes were never only about plants and preparation. They were about continuity, about ensuring that knowledge, however precarious, could survive in the hands of those most likely to need it. Thus, the remedies whispered from mother to daughter represented more than just practical survival. They embodied the tension of medieval household medicine, vital but vulnerable, respected but often unacknowledged, trusted yet always at risk of suspicion. Each recipe carried both the wisdom of the past and the uncertainty of the present, preserved in memory and voice rather than parchment and ink. The very intimacy that made remedies powerful also made them dangerous. A recipe whispered from mother to daughter might heal, comfort, or protect, but in the wrong context, the same knowledge could be twisted into evidence of wrongdoing. Medieval society often viewed women's authority in household medicine with unease, especially when success blurred the lines between healing and superstition. Remedies that worked too well, or that seemed too mysterious, could attract suspicion. And in a world where illness and misfortune were never far away, suspicion was a powerful force. One of the main tensions lay in the fact that women's remedies were private, unrecorded, and shielded from formal oversight. Unlike the physicians trained in universities or the monks who wrote medical texts in Latin, housewives passed knowledge orally in vernacular speech without clerical or scholarly approval. This alone set them apart. If a cure succeeded, it raised questions about where such knowledge came from. If it failed, it could be reinterpreted as careless, deceptive, or even malicious. Either way, women found themselves vulnerable to being judged not just by their results, but by the mere possession of knowledge that others considered unusual. For example, a woman who could calm fevers with herbs might be quietly admired in her village until a death occurred despite her efforts. In such moments, grief and fear needed an outlet. Families sometimes sought someone to blame, and the very woman who had tried to help could become the target of their frustration. Her remedies might be reinterpreted as harmful spells rather than healing recipes. Instead of being praised for her skills, she could be accused of meddling with forces beyond human control. The social position of women amplified these risks. Because most housewives lacked official authority, their remedies existed in a grey area between medicine and magic. The church reinforced this uncertainty by preaching against superstitions, charms, and anything that blurred the boundary between natural cures and spiritual interference. Yet in practice, that boundary was often unclear. Was a sprig of herbs hung over a child's bed a simple remedy or a charm against evil? Was a whispered prayer during healing a sign of piety or of forbidden ritual? Interpretations depended less on the act itself and more on the attitudes of neighbours, priests or local officials. Accusations often emerged in times of crisis. During epidemics, when disease spread uncontrollably, people searched for explanations. Remedies that once seemed harmless could suddenly look sinister when they failed to protect against plague or when they appeared too effective for comfort. Stories circulated of women accused of causing illness rather than curing it, their herbal brews reframed as poisons. The very skills that had once made them indispensable now marked them as threats. Even success carried risks. A woman who became known for her remedies might attract more attention than was safe. If she gained a reputation for healing that rivaled or overshadowed the work of priests or licensed practitioners, resentment could follow. Her abilities could be cast not as wisdom inherited from her mother, but as powers granted through dangerous alliances. Whispers of witchcraft were never far from women whose knowledge seemed to exceed their station. This dynamic reveals how fragile the line was between usefulness and danger. Remedies depended on secrecy, not just because they were practical knowledge, but because openness could draw unwanted scrutiny. A whispered recipe remained within the family not only to protect its value, but also to protect the woman who carried it. Sharing too widely, boasting of success, or appearing too confident could transform respect into suspicion. What was whispered in the kitchen could be turned against its keeper in the marketplace or the churchyard. The risks of accusation also explain why many remedies were framed in religious terms. A woman might preface her instructions with a prayer or describe her cure as blessed by God to protect herself from suspicion. This layering of piety onto practical medicine was both genuine belief and defensive strategy. By aligning remedies with faith, women sought to show that their knowledge served God's creation rather than undermined it. But even this could not always guard against suspicion when misfortune struck. Ultimately, the possibility of accusation shadowed every whispered recipe. Remedies were essential for survival, yet they carried with them the danger of being misunderstood or misrepresented. The very qualities that gave women quiet authority within their households, memory, skill, and inherited wisdom, could be recast as evidence of subversion. In this way, every act of healing was also an act of risk, and so remedies in the medieval world were never just about health. They were about trust, reputation, and the fragile balance between helping and being accused. A woman who whispered a recipe to her daughter did more than pass on knowledge of plants. She passed on the unspoken lesson that healing was both a duty and a danger, a gift that might save lives, but also one that could, under the wrong eyes, bring ruin. If whispered recipes carried dangers, so too did whispered affections. In the medieval household, silence was not only a survival tool for remedies and domestic knowledge, but also for matters of the heart. Women, especially housewives, lived under constant scrutiny by husbands, in-laws, neighbours and the church. Their conduct was not merely a private matter, but a reflection of household honour and community order. To harbour affection outside marriage or to allow it to be suspected was to risk ruin. Marriage itself was rarely founded on love. Alliances, inheritance and the pooling of labour defined most unions. Emotional or physical fulfilment was secondary and for many women, absent altogether. In this atmosphere, it was not uncommon for housewives to seek or to be sought after in secret. Yet the risks of such affairs were far greater for them than for men. While a husband's straying might be shrugged off or quietly tolerated, a wife's suspected disloyalty threatened lineage, inheritance and reputation. The fear of discovery was constant. Villages were tight-knit, homes small and privacy scarce. A woman could not easily slip away without someone noticing. Even subtle gestures, lingering eye contact at the market, a visit that lasted a little too long could stir rumours. And in a world where gossip carried the weight of testimony, even suspicion could be enough to tarnish a woman's standing. Accusations of adultery were devastating. Beyond the shame, the legal and social consequences could be severe. In some towns, public penance was enforced, with women made to stand before their community as examples of sin. In harsher cases, punishments could include beatings, fines, or the stripping away of property and security. A husband wronged might seek to cast out his wife, leaving her vulnerable in a society where women rarely had independent means of survival. The family's children could be marked by stigma, their inheritance rights questioned if legitimacy was doubted. The church added another layer of peril. Adultery was not only a social scandal, but a mortal sin, threatening eternal damnation. Priests thundered against it in sermons, and confession offered little protection if rumours had already spread. A woman who admitted to indiscretion placed her soul in the hands of clergy who might view her not as repentant, but as an example to be disciplined. Silence, therefore, became the shield. Silence in action, silence in speech, and silence in the keeping of one's own secrets. Yet affairs persisted, precisely because human longing did not vanish within the structures of duty. Letters exchanged in hidden corners, meetings in barns or by hedgerows, even carefully coded songs or poems, all became outlets for desires unfulfilled in formal marriage. Such secrecy required cunning and trust, but also carried the heavy knowledge that betrayal or carelessness could destroy everything. A servant who noticed too much, a child who repeated an overheard word, or a neighbour inclined to pry could unravel months or years of careful concealment. Interestingly, the double standard of medieval morality meant that some women bore harsher scrutiny than others. A noblewoman's indiscretion, if discovered, could reshape alliances and spark feuds between families, sometimes even wars. For peasant women, the consequences were often more immediate and personal: beatings, abandonment, or lifelong stigma in their small communities. In both cases, the woman bore the greater share of blame, while men's roles in such affairs were frequently minimised or excused. Even the suspicion of disloyalty could be weaponised. A husband who wished to discredit his wife, a neighbour seeking to damage her standing, or an in-law angling for inheritance advantages could spread rumours that she had strayed. In some cases, women were accused not out of truth, but out of malice, their reputations destroyed by whispers that carried no proof. This vulnerability made silence not only a personal strategy, but also a household necessity. Every glance, every word, every movement had to be carefully managed. It is important to note that accusations did not always need proof. Gossip itself could condemn. A husband, if motivated by anger, jealousy, or a desire to remarry, might accuse his wife to free himself from the marriage. Neighbours, too, could use accusations of unfaithfulness as a weapon in disputes over land, resources, or status. In such cases, truth mattered less than perception, and once the community believed a woman guilty, her ability to defend herself was limited. Surviving such accusations often required careful alliances. A woman might rely on the loyalty of family members or trusted neighbours to counter gossip and provide alternative explanations for her behaviour. For instance, if she was seen walking with a man, allies could vouch that it was business-related or done out of necessity. Still, these defences were fragile. A single slip in the balance of rumour could undo months or years of careful management. The fear of exposure shaped women's choices. Many who did form emotional or physical bonds outside their marriage relied on extraordinary caution. Meetings were brief, conducted under the guise of ordinary chores, and sometimes mediated through letter tokens passed discreetly. Even then, the risk was constant, and the knowledge that discovery meant ruin hung heavy over such liaisons. In contrast, men who strayed faced fewer repercussions. While the church officially condemned adultery on both sides, enforcement was uneven. Husbands might be scolded or fined, but rarely did their entire household standing collapse because of their actions. This imbalance added to the precariousness of women's position, making their fidelity not only a personal expectation, but a cornerstone of the social and economic order. Ultimately, the danger of being caught unfaithful reveals just how tightly women's lives were bound by the expectations of loyalty and obedience. For housewives in medieval villages, love or desire beyond marriage was not simply a private matter, it was a potential catastrophe. The same community that offered protection through shared work and solidarity could just as easily turn hostile, fueled by gossip, suspicion, and the ever-present moral authority of the church. This reality forced women to navigate their lives with a constant awareness of how they were seen. Every word, gesture, and choice carried the potential for misinterpretation. To be accused of unfaithfulness was to stand on the edge of ruin, with little recourse once the accusation took hold. In this way, silence, secrecy, and the delicate management of gossip were not just habits but necessities, tools of survival in a world where a single slip could cost everything. For all the danger that secrecy carried in the personal sphere, it was also a vital tool in another part of housewives' lives, the economy. Beneath the formal structures of landholding, guilds and markets, there existed a hidden economy where women, often quietly and without official recognition, carried out deals that kept their families afloat. Housewives were not simply passive keepers of hearth and home. They were active participants in exchanges of goods, services, and favours, transactions that rarely appeared in official records, but were central to village survival. Much of this hidden economy revolved around barter. In communities where coinage was scarce and wages unreliable, women often swapped what they had in surplus for what they lacked. A few extra loaves of bread, spun thread, or leftover herbs might be exchanged for a neighbour's eggs, milk, or firewood. These transactions often happened under the table, away from market tolls and guild restrictions, and depended on trust, reputation, and the informal networks built among women at wells, ovens, and washhouses. The scale of such exchanges was small, but their impact was significant. A husband might believe he was the sole provider through field labour or hired work, but the reality was that his household survival often depended on the quiet deals his wife made in the background. These were not dramatic transactions, but steady, repeated arrangements that filled gaps and buffered families against hunger, illness, or poor harvests. Women also played a role in money lending, though always discreetly. A housewife with a few coins saved from selling surplus produce might loan them to a struggling neighbour, expecting repayment in kind or with interest. This practice was risky. The church condemned usury, and debts could spark disputes. But for many women, lending was a way to turn small savings into influence. A woman who could offer a loan quietly elevated her household status and secured reciprocal favours, ensuring help in future times of need. The hidden economy also extended into small-scale production. Housewives brewed ale, baked bread, or spun wool, not only for their own homes, but also to sell or trade within their communities. Yet guild rules often restricted women from selling openly, particularly in towns where male artisans guarded their trades. As a result, women's contributions slipped into semi-legal territory. A few jars of ale sold from a back door, or a basket of yarn passed to a neighbour, could supplement household income while avoiding guild oversight. Secrecy was essential here too, but of a different kind than in matters of love or fidelity. Rather than hiding from gossip, women shielded their economic activities from officials who might demand taxes, fines, or restrictions. In many towns, women were fined for unlicensed brewing or selling, yet the fines themselves show just how widespread these practices were. Housewives calculated the risk. A small penalty might be worth the steady flow of income from their hidden trade. Beyond goods and money, women trafficked in favours and labour. They nursed the sick, tended children, or helped with harvests in exchange for food, cloth, or shelter. Such exchanges blurred the line between work and neighbourly duty, but they formed the backbone of the informal support systems that sustained communities. These networks were especially important for widows or poorer families who lacked steady male labour but could contribute through these under-the-table arrangements. The hidden economy also provided women with a degree of independence. While most wealth and property legally belonged to men, the coins earned or goods traded in secret gave women a measure of personal agency. A few hidden pennies might be tucked away for emergencies, for dowries, or even for bribes to smooth over disputes. These quiet savings, invisible to husbands and officials alike, could spell the difference between vulnerability and resilience. At the same time, these activities carried risks similar to those of unfaithfulness, though of a different kind. If discovered by guild authorities, women could face fines or bans. If caught by their husbands, disputes might arise over control of money or property, and if neighbours turned envious, gossip could spread just as dangerously as it did about affairs of the heart. In this way, women constantly balanced the benefits of participation in the hidden economy against the dangers of exposure. Yet despite the risks, housewives persisted. The survival of their families depended on it, and so did the stability of their communities. The hidden economy was not simply a marginal part of medieval life. It was the unrecorded foundation upon which the more formal systems rested. Without the under-the-table deals managed by housewives, many villages and households would have found it impossible to endure the uncertainties of medieval existence. And so, just as secrecy shielded women in matters of reputation, it also shielded them in matters of survival. Behind every loaf baked, every thread spun, every whispered agreement by the hearthfire, housewives sustained a network of quiet transactions that history's official records rarely mention. But in the fabric of daily life, these hidden exchanges were as essential as any field ploughed or tithe paid. The hidden economy of medieval housewives did not stop at small favours and neighbourly barter. In many communities, particularly in market towns and larger villages, women became key players in secret markets where foodstuffs and household goods were exchanged outside of official oversight. These markets did not usually operate as organised events, but emerged in doorways, back alleys and kitchens, woven into the rhythms of everyday life. At their centre were some of the most basic commodities: eggs, ale and cloth. Eggs were a common unit of exchange, accessible to even modest households with a few hens scratching in the yard. While men typically controlled larger livestock like cattle or sheep, women oversaw poultry, which required daily care and produced small but regular yields. A housewife might gather enough eggs over the week to sell a portion in town, quietly slipping them into baskets bound for neighbours or travellers. In theory, selling food required adherence to local market rules and payment of stall fees. In practice, women often bypassed the official system, selling eggs directly from their homes or at the fringes of market days. This allowed them to keep more profit and avoid guild restrictions, but it also opened the possibility of fines if caught. Ali was another cornerstone of the secret economy. Brewing was a household skill, and for centuries women dominated the trade as alewives. Brewing ale for family consumption was expected, but selling it without a licence blurred into illegality. Ale was essential for daily life, safer to drink than water, and consumed by all classes. When households brewed more than they needed, the surplus often found its way into the neighbourhood, sold by the jug, shared in exchange for labour, or quietly traded for other goods. Some women brewed on such a scale that it rivaled professional production, undercutting guild-regulated brewers. Municipal records across Europe show repeated fines for unlicensed ale selling, evidence both of the authorities' attempts to control the trade and of its persistent appeal to housewives as a reliable source of cash income. Cloth occupied a different place in these secret markets. Spinning and weaving were part of women's daily work, and surplus yarn or woven fabric often entered informal trade. In rural communities, women exchanged homespun thread for foodstuffs or firewood. In towns, cloth sales became more sensitive since guilds tightly controlled textile production. Still, women found ways to skirt the rules. Some sold unfinished yarn to neighbours, others traded scraps of cloth to tailors for small sums. Records of illicit cloth working and fines for women selling textiles outside guild authorisation show just how common this activity was. These were not vast enterprises, but modest efforts to make household labour pay in ways that went beyond subsistence. The importance of these secret markets lay not only in the goods exchanged, but in the independence they provided. For many housewives, eggs, ale and cloth represented a form of currency over which they had direct control. The profits, though small, could be kept aside without passing through their husbands' hands. A few pennies from ale sales or a basket of eggs traded for a length of cloth could provide the margin that allowed a family to meet obligations, pay dues, or simply survive a poor harvest. Yet these activities also drew criticism. Authorities often accused alewives of dishonest measures, diluting ale, overcharging, or selling poor quality drink. Women who sold eggs or cloth outside official stalls were seen as undermining market order. In towns, guilds and councils tried repeatedly to regulate these practices, but enforcement was inconsistent. For many officials, these fines and fees became a source of revenue in themselves. Housewives, in turn, calculated whether the cost of a fine outweighed the profits of continued trade. In many cases, they simply paid the occasional penalty and carried on. Social perception of this quiet commerce was complex. On the one hand, neighbours relied on it. Buying eggs from a woman next door or ale from a nearby household was convenient and often cheaper than market prices. On the other hand, the line between resourceful housewife and dishonest trader was thin. Accusations of short measures or poor quality goods could easily slide into slander, damaging reputations in ways not unlike gossip about personal conduct. For women, the economic and social risks were intertwined, and success depended on managing both. Still, the persistence of these secret markets shows how deeply they were embedded in daily life. Housewives did not treat them as marginal or exceptional, but as a normal extension of household duties. Gathering eggs, brewing ale, and spinning cloth were already part of women's work. Turning that work into exchangeable goods was simply a logical step, one that gave them influence in local economies often closed to them by formal rules. In this way, the hidden economy and secret markets overlapped. The same discretion that shielded personal affairs also shielded commerce. Both required careful judgment about what to reveal, whom to trust, and how to balance benefit against potential danger. And in both cases, women carried the knowledge and skill to navigate these risks, ensuring that their households remained viable in a world where survival often depended on what was done quietly, out of sight of officials and sometimes even of family. The informal sales of eggs, ale and cloth were only part of the hidden economy in which medieval housewives operated. Just as important, though less visible, were the practices of lending and borrowing that took place within neighbourhoods and kin networks. These activities rarely appeared in official records unless disputes arose, yet they formed the backbone of everyday survival. Quiet exchanges of money, goods, and favours allowed households to weather shortfalls and meet obligations that could not wait for harvests or wages. At its simplest, borrowing took the form of food or household supplies. A woman might ask a neighbour for a measure of flour, a jug of ale, or a few eggs, with the promise to repay in kind when her household stores allowed. These transactions depended on trust and reciprocity, often reinforced by years of shared labour and mutual dependence. Unlike formal markets, no money changed hands. The value lay in maintaining good relations and ensuring that help would be available when needed in return. For poorer households, such borrowing was not optional but essential, bridging the gap between subsistence and hunger during lean months. Monetary loans were more complicated but equally widespread. Though church law technically prohibited usury, charging interest on loans, small-scale lending occurred constantly in towns and villages. Housewives often acted as intermediaries, lending out small sums from household savings or managing money entrusted to them by relatives. Interest was sometimes disguised as a gift on repayment or as an extra service rendered, allowing the transaction to escape formal condemnation. For women, lending carried risk but also prestige. A housewife who could afford to loan money, however modest the amount, displayed both economic stability and influence within her community. Borrowing money, in turn, was often a matter of survival. Men might borrow to cover rents, taxes, or agricultural needs, but women frequently arranged the smaller loans that kept the household functioning day to day. A few coins borrowed discreetly could pay for bread, fuel, or cloth until wages or harvest came in. These exchanges were rarely recorded in official contracts, but rested on personal trust. Defaulting could damage reputations, not only for the borrower, but for the entire household. In this way, the social cost of debt could be as significant as the financial one. Beyond money and goods, there existed what might be called quiet trades, exchanges of labour and skill that slipped beneath the notice of authorities. A woman skilled in brewing might agree to supply ale for a neighbour's gathering in return for help at harvest. Another might mend clothing in exchange for firewood or milk. These trades blurred the line between household duty and commerce, transforming private skills into community resources. For many housewives, such exchanges offered a way to contribute economically without stepping openly into male-dominated markets or guild-regulated trades. These quiet trades also extended into the management of credit. In some communities, women effectively ran small-scale systems of deferred payment. A customer might take eggs or ale on tick, promising to repay later in cash or goods. Housewives kept track of these debts in memory, or occasionally with tally sticks or marks scratched onto walls or boards. Though informal, these credit arrangements were vital, especially for households without immediate access to cash. They also placed women in positions of authority, as creditors deciding who could be trusted and when repayment would be demanded. Yet this sphere of lending and borrowing was not without its dangers. Accusations of dishonesty could arise quickly if repayment was delayed or goods judged inferior. A dispute over a few pennies or a basket of goods could escalate into slander, damaging a woman's standing in her neighbourhood. Some women were even dragged into court, accused of overcharging, lending at unlawful interest, or failing to honour agreements. These conflicts reveal how precarious the position of the housewife broker could be, balancing between the need to secure her household and the risk of appearing exploitative. Despite these risks, the persistence of such practices underscores their necessity. formal markets and official economies rarely accommodated the realities of daily life in medieval villages and towns. Taxes, rents, and guild fees could not always be met with seasonal harvests or irregular wages. It was the informal exchanges, the borrowed coin, the jug of ale taken on credit, the mended tunic traded for firewood, that filled the gaps. Housewives, through their management of these exchanges, became essential figures in maintaining community stability. In the end, lending, borrowing, and quiet trades were less about bending rules than about survival within them. Women operated in a grey zone between legality and necessity, relying on networks of trust and reputation rather than formal contracts. They extended credit, managed debts, and ensured that households could function in the face of uncertainty. These activities may not have appeared in official ledgers, but they were no less central to the medieval economy. Without them, the fragile balance of village and town life would have been far harder to maintain. The informal lending, borrowing, and quiet trades that housewives managed revealed just how central their economic role could be in sustaining a household. Yet in some cases, these activities not only supplemented a husband's income, but actually surpassed it. When women out-earned their husbands, the balance of authority within the home could shift in subtle but significant ways. Although medieval society was structured to favour men's dominance, the realities of the hidden economy often gave women leverage that was harder to dismiss. For labourers, artisans, and peasants alike, wages were unpredictable. Agricultural work fluctuated with the seasons, and bad harvests or reduced demand for labour could leave men without steady earnings. Craftsmen might depend on irregular commissions or struggle against guild restrictions that limited their opportunities. In contrast, many women's activities, such as brewing ale, baking bread, spinning yarn, or running small-scale market stalls, provided steadier, if modest, income streams. Because these trades dealt with goods in constant demand, women could generate a flow of earnings that rivaled or even exceeded their husbands' wages. Ale brewing offers a clear example. Brewing was traditionally a woman's task, and in towns across England and Northern Europe, alewives became central figures in the local economy. A skilled brewer with access to grain could produce a product that sold quickly and regularly, often bringing in more cash than a husband's occasional day labour. Though some guilds and authorities later tried to regulate brewing more strictly, its accessibility made it one of the most important female-driven trades of the Middle Ages. Records from manorial courts regularly mention women fined for short measure or poor quality, an indirect sign of just how involved they were and how profitable the trade could be. Textile production was another avenue where women could surpass their husbands financially. Spinning, weaving and sewing were constant tasks within households, but surplus cloth or yarn could be sold in markets or to merchants. In regions tied to the wool trade, such as Flanders or England, a woman's labour in spinning and preparing wool was vital to the broader economy. Payment for spinning was small per unit but steady, and for families where the husband had irregular work, the wife's income from textiles often became the more reliable source of cash. In towns, women sometimes extended their involvement into small-scale shopkeeping or service trades. Selling baked goods, dairy products or firewood could provide steady returns. Midwives, laundresses and washerwomen also earned income directly for their labour, often paid by wealthier households. These occupations were not glamorous, but they gave women financial independence in ways that field labour could not. In some cases, records show women who, through consistent work in these trades, accumulated more savings than their husbands, an outcome that unsettled the conventional hierarchy of the household. When wives out-earned their husbands, the social consequences were complicated. On one hand, extra income could improve the household's standard of living, securing food, clothing, and the ability to pay rents or dues more reliably. On the other, it could provoke tension within marriages. Male authority was legally and socially reinforced, but reliance on a wife's earnings could challenge that authority in practice. A man who failed to provide while his wife kept the household afloat risked ridicule from neighbours, who might view him as weak or incompetent. In a society where masculinity was tied to provision and protection, the inversion of roles could be deeply unsettling. Some men adapted by asserting control over their wives' profits, framing them as part of the household's collective income rather than her personal achievement. Others, however, clashed with wives who defended their right to manage their own earnings. Court cases occasionally revealed disputes where women accused husbands of wasting their profits, or where men accused wives of withholding money. These conflicts underscore how economic realities could strain the boundaries of gender expectations, especially when a woman's earnings gave her more autonomy than custom allowed. Despite such tensions, many women who out-earned their husbands did so quietly, careful not to provoke resentment or appear boastful. Just as with secret trades and lending, discretion was vital. A woman might control the household purse in practice, but defer publicly to her husband's authority, maintaining the outward image of traditional hierarchy. In this way, financial power was exercised subtly, ensuring survival without drawing undue attention. Nevertheless, the fact that women could, and often did, out-earn their husbands challenges the assumption that medieval women were merely dependents. Their participation in hidden economies, informal markets, and steady trades provided them with both income and influence. While society rarely acknowledged this openly, the quiet resilience of these women was a critical force in keeping households afloat. Without their earnings, many families would not have survived the economic instability of medieval life. The quiet strength that women exercised through income and household management was rarely celebrated in open terms, but it became a crucial mechanism for negotiating personal freedom. Within a world where obedience to husbands, fathers, and broader community norms was expected, women found ways to shape the terms of their daily lives without directly challenging authority. This negotiation of freedom, subtle, restrained, and often hidden, allowed them to preserve dignity and influence while maintaining the outward image of obedience. At the centre of this balancing act was the understanding that a woman's survival depended on her ability to avoid direct confrontation with social structures. A wife who openly flaunted authority, whether by controlling money or making independent choices, risked gossip, conflict, and even legal repercussions. Communities were quick to condemn women perceived as unruly or insubordinate. Yet women were not powerless. They learned that small concessions to expectation could create room for manoeuvring. Publicly, they might present themselves as deferential wives and dutiful mothers, but privately they could exert a surprising degree of control over resources, decisions, and even relationships. Money was often the clearest tool in this negotiation. A wife who managed household accounts could decide which bills to pay first, which debts to delay, and which investments, however modest, to make. If she earned income through brewing, spinning, or selling goods, she might keep a portion aside before handing the rest to her husband. In this way, she could maintain a degree of independence without openly defying his role as household head. The act of yielding visible control while retaining invisible influence was a calculated survival strategy. Negotiation extended beyond money. Within the household, decisions about food preparation, child rearing, and the daily running of domestic life gave women authority that was difficult for men to contest. A husband might claim formal control, but if he relied on his wife to manage provisions, he had little choice but to accept her decisions on what to cook, when to ration, or how to allocate resources. Wives often used this responsibility to their advantage, exercising judgment that shaped the family's standard of living in ways not immediately obvious from outside the home. This form of hidden influence was not unique to peasants or labourers. In towns and among the middling classes, wives of artisans and merchants often acted as partners in their husbands' businesses, even if not formally acknowledged. A woman might manage accounts, organise apprentices, or negotiate small sales, all while maintaining the public role of obedient spouse. Court records occasionally hint at this duality, women insisting that they acted only under their husband's authority, even while evidence suggests they managed business affairs with considerable independence. The language of obedience was thus both shield and strategy, a way to navigate systems that required submission while carving out space for autonomy. Of course, these negotiations were fragile. A misstep, being too open about personal savings, appearing too independent in dealings, or being caught in a contradiction could undo carefully maintained appearances. Communities were deeply invested in policing gender roles, and neighbours were often quick to interpret a woman's assertiveness as dangerous. Accusations of being a scold, or worse, hints of witchcraft could follow women who stepped too far beyond the expected boundaries of obedience. For this reason, the ability to appear compliant was as valuable as any hidden act of independence. In many ways, this quiet dance between obedience and freedom defined the daily experience of medieval housewives. Their influence was not revolutionary, nor did it challenge the overarching structures of patriarchy. Instead, it worked within them, bending rules where possible, softening restrictions through practical necessity, and shaping outcomes in ways that were rarely recorded in official documents. By outwardly agreeing to their prescribed roles, women reduced suspicion and protected themselves, while behind the scenes they ensured that their families survived, and that they themselves retained some measure of control over their own lives. The picture that emerges is not one of passive submission, but of calculated negotiation. Far from being powerless, housewives demonstrated remarkable skill in managing the contradictions of their world. They lived within the boundaries set for them, but they also learned how to stretch those boundaries, creating small freedoms behind the facade of obedience. In doing so, they revealed a truth that was often unspoken. Survival in the medieval household required not only labour and loyalty, but also quiet cunning and strategic compromise. While fathers were considered the formal heads of households and were often seen as responsible for discipline, education, and the family's moral direction, in practice, mothers held daily control over how children were raised. This influence operated quietly, shaped by necessity, proximity, and the rhythms of domestic life. Much like managing money, raising children became an area where women navigated obedience in public, but exercised private authority in ways that could profoundly affect the household's future. Child rearing in the medieval world was a constant negotiation between survival and expectation. Infant mortality was high, resources were limited, and the line between nourishment and neglect could be thin. A mother's choices in breastfeeding, weaning, feeding, and caring for the sick determined whether a child thrived or failed to grow. Officially, these decisions were matters of custom or paternal authority, but in reality, the mother's hands carried out the work, and with that work came the chance to make decisions. For example, a woman might choose to extend breastfeeding longer than expected, either to improve a child's survival chances or to delay another pregnancy. Such a decision could be justified as practical, but it also reflected a hidden exercise of agency over her own body and family planning. Education, too, often began at a mother's side. Though boys might eventually be apprenticed, trained in a trade, or sent to school if the family could afford it, the first years of learning came from the household itself. Women taught children to speak, to pray, to follow basic moral lessons, and to understand the rhythms of work. Daughters especially absorbed their mother's skills: spinning, cooking, weaving, cleaning, and managing the flow of household duties. These were not only practical lessons, but also cultural ones, shaping how girls understood their roles in society and what forms of independence they might pursue. In teaching these skills, women made choices about what to emphasize, what to downplay, and what values to instill. Discipline was another area where hidden choices mattered. While fathers were seen as the enforcers of order, mothers were often the first line of correction. A woman could decide to overlook a minor disobedience, to soften punishment, or to emphasize compassion rather than severity. In some cases, this created tensions within households. If a father demanded stricter enforcement, a mother might comply outwardly, but quietly adjust her approach when alone with her children. Such decisions could shape a child's sense of trust, loyalty, and even their future attitudes toward authority. Religious instruction was also deeply influenced by mothers. Children were taught prayers, guided through church rituals, and introduced to the moral frameworks of the Christian world within the domestic sphere. While priests and fathers reinforced these structures in public, the daily act of reciting prayers before bed or teaching the meaning of feast days often fell to women. A mother who emphasized certain saints, particular rituals, or the importance of small acts of piety could shape her children's spiritual outlook in ways that might go unnoticed by outsiders. These hidden choices mattered especially in times of crisis. During illness, famine, or war, women were forced to make decisions about which children to prioritize with limited food or care. Such decisions were rarely spoken aloud, but they were real and deeply consequential. A mother might secretly give more bread to a frail child in hopes of saving them, or she might favor an older child who was already contributing to the household. These were harsh realities that revealed the extent of women's authority in practice, even if it was never acknowledged formally. What makes these acts particularly significant is that they demonstrate how housewives shaped the next generation while maintaining the outward appearance of obedience. Fathers might claim to guide the moral and physical upbringing of children, but the subtle, everyday choices made by mothers left marks that could last a lifetime. Their influence extended not just to the health and survival of their children, but also to the quiet transmission of values, skills, and strategies for survival in a society that demanded obedience but rewarded cunning. In this sense, child rearing was both a duty and a realm of hidden power. Women negotiated freedom behind the mask of obedience, not through grand gestures, but through thousands of small decisions: how to nurse, when to discipline, what to teach, and whom to protect most fiercely. It was a delicate balance, but one that reveals how medieval housewives carved out influence in places where the written record rarely looks. Through children, they secured a quiet legacy, one that shaped not only their families, but also the survival of their communities. While child-rearing gave women space to exert subtle influence, the broader management of the household itself provided another avenue for quiet resistance. The medieval housewife was expected to be dutiful, obedient, and modest, yet she also stood at the centre of domestic operations. The household was both her workplace and her sphere of control. Within that domain, countless small acts could be used to resist or redirect the authority of husbands, fathers, or local expectations without ever appearing openly defiant. Food was often the most immediate and powerful tool. A wife decided how rations were distributed, how ingredients were used, and which meals were prepared. In poor households where bread, pottage, and ale made up the staples, these choices had serious consequences. A woman might slip an extra portion to a favoured child, stretch grain by adding herbs or less desirable fillers, or trade a poor household stock for something else. None of these decisions would seem outwardly rebellious, but they allowed her to shape the well-being of her family in ways that quietly defied the strict control of male authority. At times, withholding or redirecting food could also serve as a message, a way of signalling discontent or asserting priorities when more direct confrontation was impossible. Clothing and textile work offered another space for hidden resistance. Women were largely responsible for spinning, weaving, mending, and laundering the garments that their families wore. This responsibility gave them discretion over which garments were repaired quickly, which were allowed to fray, and which were passed down to children or traded. A wife could ensure her own clothing was carefully maintained to preserve her dignity, even if her husband's tunic was left patched a little later than he might prefer. These were not dramatic gestures, but they were choices that shaped presentation, reputation, and even comfort. In societies where appearance could influence how one was treated in the marketplace or the churchyard, these quiet acts mattered. The regulation of cleanliness, or at least of odour, could also serve as a form of control. Women decided when to wash linens, how often to air out garments, and whether to sprinkle herbs or rose water to mask the constant smells of daily life. In some cases, the use of herbs and scents became not only a matter of comfort, but also an assertion of dignity in the face of hardship. A wife might ensure her own corner of the home smelled fresher than the rest, or she might deliberately neglect these practices when resentment simmered. Such decisions could serve as indirect forms of communication, expressions of power in a world where open defiance was risky. Even the act of hospitality could be an area for resistance. Visitors, neighbours, and travelling traders often passed through village homes, and the way a wife chose to welcome or withhold hospitality carried social weight. By offering generous portions of food or ale, she could build alliances beyond her husband's control. By being less welcoming, she could quietly punish those who had offended her or her household. These acts were rarely documented, but they formed part of the intricate web of social negotiations that sustained community life. Women learned to navigate them carefully, using their authority over the domestic sphere to strengthen their own positions. Religious practice within the home also created opportunities for subtle defiance. And while the church dictated the forms of worship and the hierarchy of spiritual authority, housewives often controlled the rhythms of daily devotion. They taught children their prayers, tended to shrines or images in the home, and selected which saints to emphasize in private supplication. Choosing to favor a local saint associated with women or childbirth, rather than those promoted by the parish priest, was itself a quiet act of independence. It allowed women to shape spiritual life within their own walls in ways that reflected their concerns more than official doctrine. At its heart, household control was about shaping the flow of daily life in ways that granted women small but meaningful power. These acts of resistance were rarely confrontational. Instead, they were woven into the routines of cooking, mending, teaching, and welcoming. They allowed women to preserve dignity, protect their children, and even influence community networks while maintaining the outward appearance of obedience. Taken together, these hidden forms of resistance reveal the complex role of housewives in medieval society. They were expected to submit, but submission did not mean passivity. Instead, they engaged in a constant negotiation of power within the household, finding ways to assert themselves without stepping outside the boundaries of what was acceptable. In this balance, resistance was not loud or public, but steady, persistent, and often decisive. In many ways, these small acts of resistance were just as important as open rebellion. They demonstrated how women preserved space for themselves within a restrictive system. Through food, clothing, cleanliness, hospitality, and devotion, they shaped not only their households, but also the broader survival of their communities. Theirs was a power seldom recognized in official records, yet quietly influential in the daily lives of medieval villages. While gestures, decisions, and subtle household acts gave women a measure of quiet control, perhaps the most powerful tool at their disposal was silence itself. In a world where words could be turned against them, whether as evidence of disobedience, gossip, or heresy, knowing when not to speak often became a crucial survival strategy. Silence could preserve dignity, avoid confrontation, and in certain moments cut sharper than any open argument. In medieval households, disputes inevitably arose over resources, authority, or behaviour. For wives, direct confrontation with their husbands was dangerous. Publicly contradicting a man could bring shame on him, which in turn often led to punishment for her. Yet saying nothing, refusing to argue, withholding a response, or simply turning inward could signal disapproval in a way that was difficult to challenge. Silence, in this sense, was a weapon wielded in plain sight, a form of defiance disguised as restraint. It denied the other party the satisfaction of escalation while still asserting a position. Silence also played a role in the wider village community, where gossip was both a lifeline and a threat. Housewives were expected to contribute to the exchange of news and rumours, yet too much talk risked accusations of slander or worse. Knowing when to keep quiet protected them from being dragged into disputes or becoming scapegoats. In some cases, silence could be a deliberate tactic. By refusing to spread a rumour or repeating only fragments of what she knew, a woman could control how stories circulated. Her silence might protect a neighbour, or conversely, by withholding information, she could allow suspicion to linger over another. In both cases, silence shaped social outcomes as much as words did. Within the context of religious life, silence was often framed as a virtue. The church taught that women should be modest, humble, and restrained in speech. Priests regularly preached against gossip and idle chatter, warning that a loose tongue could lead souls into sin. For many housewives, embracing silence in public was both a way of conforming to these expectations and of guarding themselves against clerical or communal scrutiny. Yet beneath the surface, it could also serve as a mask, allowing women to keep their true thoughts hidden while appearing pious and obedient. Silence also functioned as protection when it came to dangerous knowledge. Women who practiced herbal healing, midwifery, or folk remedies often found themselves walking a fine line between being valued for their skills and being accused of witchcraft or superstition. Passing on knowledge to daughters or trusted neighbours was done quietly, often without writing, to minimise risks. Equally important was knowing when to say nothing, when to deny knowledge, when to feign ignorance, and when to let men believe the credit for a cure belonged to chance or divine intervention. In these moments, silence safeguarded not only reputations, but lives. On a personal level, silence could also be an act of withdrawal, a way for women to carve out space in cramped, noisy homes. In households where privacy was scarce, retreating into quietness allowed a woman to claim a form of interior independence. Even in the midst of daily chores, she could choose not to engage, not to answer, not to explain. This withdrawal did not stop her from fulfilling expected duties, but it gave her a shield against constant demands on her energy and attention. Perhaps the most striking use of silence was in moments of open injustice. A wife who endured violence, harsh words, or humiliation often had no recourse to outside help. Speaking up rarely brought justice. It often made matters worse. But silence in the face of such treatment could, paradoxically, be a form of strength. Refusing to cry out, refusing to beg, refusing to show fear denied abusers the satisfaction of dominance. It was not a solution, but it was a way of holding on to some measure of control in situations where little else could be managed. Seen in this light, silence was not passive, it was active. It was chosen, honed, and used deliberately. It could shield a woman from danger, communicate disapproval, protect her secrets, and preserve her dignity. In societies where women's voices were often restricted or discounted, silence itself became a language. It could convey more than words, shaping relationships and outcomes in ways that were subtle but profound. Thus, when we examine the hidden strategies of medieval housewives, we must place silence alongside food, cloth, herbs, and household authority as one of their most important tools. It may not leave records in ledgers or appear in court documents, but it was present in kitchens, in market stalls, in whispered prayers, and in moments of confrontation. Silence endured where speech would falter, and in that endurance lay both protection and quiet resistance. If silence was one of the sharpest tools in a housewife's arsenal, smell was one of the hardest battles she faced. The medieval home was never free from odours. Smoke clung to rafters and clothes alike. Damp earth seeped in through poorly sealed walls. Human and animal waste lingered in alleyways, courtyards, and even within reach of the family hearth. Against this tide, women developed a repertoire of quiet strategies, small but persistent acts that tried to make daily life more bearable. Masking smells did not mean erasing them. That was impossible in the crowded, unwashed world of the Middle Ages. Instead, it meant shifting the balance, dulling the foulness with herbs, resins, or simple tricks of arrangement. Housewives would scatter rushes and straw across dirt floors, both to absorb waste and to carry the scent of whatever plants were woven into the bundles. Sweet herbs like lavender, sage, or thyme were often added to rushes, not only for their pleasant fragrance, but also for their supposed power to drive away illness. Every step released a hint of freshness, a contrast against the stagnant air. Linens offered another opportunity. While laundering was arduous and infrequent, when it was done, women took pains to leave a mark of care upon the fabric. Bedclothes or shirts might be sprinkled with rose water or rubbed with dried lavender or rosemary before being folded away. The scent did not last long, but for a brief while, slipping into bed meant encountering something cleaner, sweeter than the day's work and smells. This practice also spoke of pride, an unspoken signal that a household, no matter how modest, could project some sense of refinement. Cooking and the hearth were equally central to this effort. A smoky fire was unpleasant, but it was also one of the most powerful tools for masking odours. The constant presence of burning wood covered many scents at once: sweat, manure, damp wool, and even sickness. Housewives sometimes threw herbs into the flames, letting the fragrant smoke drift through small windowless rooms. Juniper, sage, or pine needles added not only a sweeter smell, but also carried associations of protection against disease. To burn them was both practical and symbolic. an act of purification for body and spirit alike. Clothing, too, was managed with tricks rather than thorough cleaning. Most garments were worn until visibly soiled, since washing was laborious and could damage cloth. Instead, women brushed dirt from wool, shook out linens, and hung garments near fires so that smoke might dry and deodorize them. Some even rubbed clothes with crushed herbs or stored them with dried flowers. These measures did not remove filth, but they created a surface impression that mattered in a world where reputation was tied to household management. Bathing, though limited, also featured occasional tricks. Full immersion was rare outside of public baths or rivers, but women made do with partial washings. Basins of water were used for faces, hands and feet, and sometimes scented with herbs or vinegar to create the impression of freshness. Vinegar in particular was valued, believed to cut through odours and guard against sickness. Housewives might also encourage children and husbands to rinse with herbal infusions, knowing that even if the body remained unwashed, the lingering hint of mint or sage was better than nothing. Even the air itself could be managed, at least in small ways. Households often hung herbs from rafters or tucked sprigs into corners, letting them dry slowly and release their fragrance. Stronger scents, like garlic or onions, were double-edged. They were indispensable in the kitchen, but their smell clung to breath and clothes. To offset this, some women chewed parsley or mint leaves after meals, small gestures of freshness in a world that otherwise expected little. Underlying all these practices was not only a concern for comfort, but also for survival. In medieval thought, foul air was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The miasma theory, widely accepted, held that bad smells carried disease. To mask or alter odours was therefore more than vanity. It was a form of protection. Housewives might not have had scientific explanations, but they observed the connections between air, health and cleanliness, and they acted accordingly. These tricks for masking filth reveal the constant, unseen labour of women in medieval households. While men worked in the fields or trades, wives fought a quieter, daily war against dirt and odour, using whatever tools they had. Their efforts rarely lasted long. Floors became dirty again, clothes absorbed smells, fires smouldered into damp smoke. But the repetition mattered. These actions marked the boundary between mere existence and a sense of order. They turned the unavoidable dirt of medieval life into something that could at least be endured. In this way, masking odours became part of the broader tapestry of hidden skills that defined a housewife's world. Just as silence could speak volumes without words, a sprig of rosemary on the hearth or a dash of rosewater on linens said something about the household and its mistress. They were small acts, often overlooked, but together they reveal the constant, unrecorded labour that kept medieval families upright in the face of filth, smell and sickness. For all the attempts to cover bad odours and present a sense of cleanliness, some household problems could not be ignored. Chief among them were lice, fleas, and the general grime that accumulated in clothing, bedding, and living spaces. These pests were an everyday reality in medieval Europe, affecting both the wealthy and the poor. A clean appearance did not mean one was free of vermin. Instead, it meant that the housewife was constantly engaged in small, practical acts of management. The lice comb was one of the most direct tools against this problem, typically made of wood, bone, or sometimes ivory for those with more means. It was a narrow comb with very fine teeth designed to trap lice and their eggs. Archaeological finds from across medieval Europe show these combs were common possessions. They were not luxury items, but basic necessities, often carried in small pouches or stored near beds. Delousing was not a one-time chore, but a continuous process. Women combed through their children's hair, checked their own, and sometimes sat together in social groups performing the same task. This practice was not limited to peasants. Monks, nobles, and even royalty were recorded as using or owning fine-tooth combs. The act was both hygienic and social, a moment of shared necessity in households where parasites were unavoidable. Rushes offered another layer of control, though they were aimed more at the household environment than the body. Floors in many medieval homes were covered with rushes, straw, or reeds. In theory, these coverings softened the hard ground or planks and made interiors more comfortable. In practice, they also absorbed spills, food scraps, and human or animal waste. Unless they were replaced regularly, rushes became breeding grounds for vermin. Some households did change them frequently, particularly wealthier ones, with servants who could manage the task. Others simply layered new rushes on top of old, allowing months' worth of debris to accumulate. Yet, the use of rushes was not purely about comfort or indifference. Housewives often tried to improve their effectiveness by sprinkling them with herbs. Sweet-smelling plants such as lavender, sage, rosemary, and mint were crushed into the flooring or scattered between layers of reeds. This was not only to mask odours, but also based on the belief that strong smells could repel pests and purify the air. The idea of bad air or miasma being a source of illness made such practices feel protective. Herbs were cheap compared to imported spices, and women gathered them from gardens or fields, drying them for later use. Even if the results were modest, they contributed to a sense of order and cleanliness within the home. Beyond the floors, fumigation with herbs was another method used to combat filth and vermin. Housewives burned bundles of herbs in hearths or braziers, letting the smoke fill a room. The goal was twofold: to freshen the air with a more pleasant scent, and to drive out insects hiding in bedding or corners. Wormwood, juniper, and rue were particularly valued for this purpose. Written household manuals and medical texts from the later Middle Ages occasionally recommended such fumigations not just for cleanliness, but for health. Smoke was thought to carry cleansing properties, and certain herbs were credited with protective virtues. In monasteries, fumigation could even have ritual connotations, echoing the incense used in church ceremonies. These strategies reflected a balance between practical necessity and cultural belief. A woman who carefully combed her family's hair, renewed the rushes, or burned herbs was not simply fighting pests. She was also fulfilling her role as the guardian of her household's health and respectability. Visitors judged a home by its smell and its state of order, and although everyone lived with lice or fleas to some degree, households that managed them were seen as more disciplined. In this way, hygiene practices were connected to moral reputation. Of course, the limitations were clear. No matter how often a comb was used or herbs were scattered, parasites returned. Rushes could not fully prevent dirt from accumulating, and fumigation offered only temporary relief. Yet these methods show that medieval people were not passive in the face of filth. They developed tools and routines to push back against discomfort. The solutions might seem incomplete by modern standards, but they represented a genuine effort to make daily life more bearable. In the end, lice combs, rushes, and fumigation herbs highlight how medieval households approached hygiene in layered, practical ways. These were not glamorous tasks, but steady, repetitive actions woven into the rhythm of domestic life. Housewives and servants bore the brunt of this labour, shaping an environment that balanced against the constant presence of pests and smells. Even in cramped, smoky rooms, they tried to create a sense of cleanliness and comfort within the limits of their world. Even with the regular use of combs, herbs, and fumigation, there remained an unspoken reality in medieval homes. The body itself still needed washing. Yet this was rarely discussed openly, either in prescriptive manuals or in community conversation. Bathing was not absent from the medieval world, but it was treated with caution, shaped by limited resources, cultural assumptions, and the practical difficulty of water access. The rituals of washing that did exist were often private, modest, and left unspoken. For many households, full immersion baths were rare. Drawing enough water to fill a tub required both labour and fuel. Buckets had to be carried from a well or stream, heated over a fire, and then poured into a wooden or metal basin. In smaller homes, space itself was a challenge, as tubs were large and cumbersome. As a result, baths tended to be occasional rather than routine. When they did occur, they often coincided with significant events such as childbirth, illness, or festivals, when extra effort was justified. In some wealthier urban centres, public bathhouses provided an alternative, but for most rural families, bathing was managed within the home, in ways that were practical but rarely spoken of. Instead of full baths, partial washing was far more common. Housewives instructed their families to wash hands, faces and feet more frequently than entire bodies. These parts were the most visible and most likely to be judged by others. Records from monastic rules and noble households suggest that hand-washing before meals was a deeply ingrained custom, as it symbolized not just cleanliness but respectability and order. Bowls of water were sometimes passed around, with cloths or napkins used to dry. In villages, children were taught to splash their faces with stream water, while adults often washed feet at the end of a long day in fields. These routines did not remove all dirt, but they became quiet markers of care and decency. Women managed much of this washing behind closed doors. They scrubbed their infants in small wooden basins, wiped their children with damp cloths, and tended to their own bodies in moments of privacy. Soap, when available, was made from animal fat mixed with ash or lime. It was harsh, often reserved for laundry, but small amounts could be used for skin. Where soap was scarce, simple rinsing with water or rubbing with herbs like sage and mint stood in its place. These practices were rarely discussed openly, perhaps because they blurred the line between domestic routine and bodily intimacy, subjects that polite conversation avoided. Even hair washing was a matter of quiet ritual. Grease and dirt built up quickly, especially in smoky houses, yet washing with water was infrequent. Instead, women might rub flour, bran, or powdered herbs into hair to absorb oils and mask odours, then comb them out. Occasionally, warm water with vinegar or lye soap was used, but this could leave hair dry and brittle. The act itself was laborious, involving preparation and clean-up, so it was saved for occasions when appearance truly mattered. For many, head coverings such as kerchiefs or coifs simply concealed the hair in between cleanings, lessening the pressure to wash openly. The silence around these rituals was partly cultural. Medieval society did not equate cleanliness with moral virtue in the same way that later centuries would. Smells and dirt were normal features of life, not causes for shame. To speak too much about bathing might even invite suspicion. Public bathhouses, though popular in towns, were often associated with immorality, as they became meeting places for socializing that blurred the boundaries of propriety. At the household level, women carried out washing duties without boasting about them, because to do so might draw unnecessary attention to the physical body, something church teachings often framed as a source of temptation or corruption. At the same time, washing rituals carried a protective function. In medical theory, rinsing with water was believed to open the pores, which left the body vulnerable to disease-bearing air. For this reason, people avoided bathing too frequently, especially in cold weather when it was thought to weaken the body. Small, quiet washings seemed safer, balancing the need for comfort with fears of exposure. Thus, women's routines of wiping, rinsing, and gently scrubbing remain practical responses to both physical dirt and cultural anxieties. By their nature, these acts were repetitive and unremarkable. A mother rinsing her baby in a basin, a man wiping dust from his arms after work, a daughter rubbing herbs onto her scalp. These were the everyday gestures of hygiene that kept households running. They were rarely recorded because they were too ordinary to note, but their absence in official accounts should not be mistaken for non-existence. They formed the fabric of domestic care, the background tasks that women performed without ceremony. In some, medieval washing rituals were modest, practical, and deliberately understated. They lacked the glamour of perfumed baths or the rigour of later cleanliness campaigns, but they mattered deeply in the rhythm of household life. By avoiding public discussion of them, women reinforced the sense that such duties were private responsibilities, not topics for communal debate. They quietly managed the balance between dirt, decency, and health, ensuring that, in a world where filth was inescapable, their families remained at least somewhat presentable and protected. The discreet nature of washing in medieval households was not only a matter of practicality, but also of cultural habit. Cleanliness, when practiced, was not usually spoken of openly, nor was it displayed as a point of pride. Unlike later centuries, where public discussion of hygiene became a moral and even nationalistic issue, medieval attitudes kept it firmly within the household. Cleanliness was a private secret, maintained quietly, guarded within the family walls, and often shaped by necessity rather than principle. One reason for this silence was the social context of bodily exposure. Washing required disrobing, at least partially, and modesty was a deeply ingrained cultural value. Even married couples often maintained boundaries of privacy, particularly in communal living arrangements where extended families or servants shared close quarters. To announce or boast about one's washing habits would mean drawing attention to the naked body, something that was rarely considered appropriate outside of medical or religious discourse. Thus, women who oversaw the family's hygiene kept these acts within the home and performed them without comment. The church also played a role in framing the way people thought about cleanliness. While religious texts frequently equated purity with spiritual cleanliness, they rarely emphasized bodily hygiene in the same way. Some church authorities even warned against excessive bathing, arguing that it encouraged vanity or indulgence. Bathhouses, especially in urban centres, acquired reputations for immorality, sometimes even being linked to prostitution. This association reinforced the idea that discussing or displaying practices of cleanliness could be morally suspect. Within such a framework, households treated hygiene as necessary but never as something to be paraded in public. Practical realities reinforced this discretion. For rural families, water had to be carried, heated and conserved. Fuel for warming bathwater competed with fuel needed for cooking and survival. Soap, if available, was too valuable to waste on unnecessary washing. As a result, any effort to maintain cleanliness represented a careful use of limited resources. Housewives who found ways to rinse their children, scrub laundry, or prepare herbal rinses for hair did so quietly, aware that others might consider such efforts frivolous if resources were scarce. In many communities, showing off cleanliness might even invite criticism rather than praise, suggesting wastefulness or misplaced priorities. Gender roles further shaped this culture of secrecy. Women bore responsibility for keeping their families reasonably presentable, but their labour was undervalued and often invisible. A man might appear at market with clean hands and a tolerable scent, but few would acknowledge that his wife or daughters had worked to achieve this result. Cleanliness was absorbed into the broader category of domestic duty, important but unspoken, like the preparation of meals or the mending of clothes. It was seen as women's work, done out of sight, and thus not something to be publicly discussed or credited. In some cases, silence was also protective. Remedies for body odour, lice, or skin conditions often overlapped with folk medicine, which could easily draw suspicion. A woman who shared too much about her household's methods might risk being accused of dabbling in charms or inappropriate knowledge. The safest path was to pass down techniques, whether for washing hair with vinegar, fumigating rooms with herbs, or discreetly scrubbing infants, within the family, especially from mother to daughter. By keeping these practices quiet, women ensured their survival across generations while avoiding outside scrutiny. At the same time, the perception of normalcy dulled the impulse to discuss cleanliness. Dirt, smell and sweat were expected parts of life. Everyone smelled of smoke, animals and work. To be too clean might actually make one stand out, raising questions about how much time or resources had been spent on appearance. In tightly knit villages where conformity mattered, blending in was often safer than being exceptional. The small efforts made toward hygiene were meant to keep a family within acceptable bounds, not to set them apart. Urban settings added another layer to this discretion. In towns, public bathhouses offered opportunities for bathing, but participation varied. Some attended for social reasons, others avoided them out of moral concerns, and many could not afford regular visits. For those who did go, it was often treated as a private indulgence, not something spoken of widely. Meanwhile, in poorer households, women continued their quiet routines of partial washing, herbal fumigation and laundering clothes in rivers. Whether in town or country, the culture of silence around cleanliness persisted. Ultimately, medieval cleanliness remained a hidden dimension of life because it straddled the boundary between necessity and propriety. To be clean was desirable, but to speak of the body and its maintenance was uncomfortable. Women sustained these practices quietly, balancing modesty, resource constraints and social expectations. Cleanliness was less a matter of open virtue and more a guarded secret, one that shaped daily life while remaining largely invisible in written records. It is this invisibility that makes the subject appear so mysterious today. The lack of detailed descriptions does not mean people ignored hygiene, only that they understood it as something to be managed privately, away from public view. Behind the smoky walls of cottages, beside rivers used for laundry, or in the dim corners of townhouses, families found their own ways to stay tolerably clean. And they did so in silence, preserving the household's dignity without ever needing to declare it aloud. Housewives, bound to the rhythms of household work and family obligations, were also central players in the flow of village information. Their labour brought them to rivers, wells, market and fields, places where women encountered each other and exchanged not just goods, but words. These moments created an informal but powerful network of communication in which secrets, warnings and judgments travelled swiftly through the community. Unlike the written documents that survive from officials, clerics or landlords, this oral network rarely left a visible trace. Yet its presence shaped daily life in profound ways. Housewives knew who had fallen ill and which remedy was tried, who was short on grain and borrowing from a neighbour, who quarrelled with a husband, and who had quietly sent a daughter to live with kin in another village. Such details rarely appeared in records, but they circulated widely in whispered conversations, giving women an important, if unofficial, authority within their communities. Part of this influence came from their vantage point. Men often travelled beyond the village boundaries to trade, pay rents or serve in military levies, but women observed the subtler currents within the settlement itself. A wife could see when a neighbour lit her hearth earlier than usual, suggesting she was feeding unexpected guests. She noticed if a child appeared in poorer clothes than before, hinting at economic strain. Even the condition of laundry hanging in the yard revealed whether a family was managing or struggling. These observations, shared among women, built an unspoken archive of the community's health, morality and stability. The exchange of such information was rarely idle chatter alone. It provided a mechanism of accountability. In a world without formal policing of everyday behaviour, gossip served as a social tool to regulate conduct. A man known to drink away his earnings might find that word had already spread to the alehouse before he arrived. A young woman seen in the wrong company could face a damaged reputation before any official authority intervened. For households balancing survival on narrow margins, this reputational economy was powerful. Women, through their networks, became both the collectors and the transmitters of this information. This role, however, was not without danger. To speak too freely could attract resentment or worse, accusations of slander. Medieval records from manorial and ecclesiastical courts show that women were frequently called to answer for their words, whether accused of defaming a neighbour or spreading unverified stories. Yet the fact that such disputes appear so often in records suggests how central this information economy was. Women's words could damage reputations, influence marriage prospects, or sway communal decisions. Their gossip carried weight, enough to be contested in formal settings. At the same time, housewives often held secrets as carefully as they spread them. The same women who passed along stories about others also protected the private matters of their own families. Discretion was a skill as valuable as speech. Knowing when to remain silent could preserve a household's standing or shield it from unwanted attention. In this balance between revealing and concealing, housewives operated as the quiet managers of social knowledge. Religious authorities were well aware of this dynamic. Preachers frequently warned against idle chatter among women, describing it as a source of discord. Yet such condemnations only highlight how common and influential these networks were. The Church's concern reflected the reality that gossip competed with official sermons and teachings in shaping moral opinion. What women whispered could matter as much as what a priest declared from the pulpit. It is important to recognise that these networks were not uniform or always harmonious. Gossip could divide as well as unite. Women from wealthier households might look down on poorer neighbours, spreading stories that reinforced hierarchy. At the same time, shared hardship, such as during a famine or epidemic, could bind women together through mutual exchange of knowledge, whether about scarce food sources, burial customs, or protective charms. Gossip was flexible, serving as both glue and weapon depending on circumstance. The authority of these networks becomes clearer when viewed in contrast with men's formal spheres of power. Land, law and warfare were largely male-dominated, but the regulation of reputation and household morality rested heavily on women's shoulders. Housewives were not merely passive figures in the background, they actively shaped how communities judged themselves. Through whispers, hints and subtle warnings, they maintained the boundaries of acceptable behaviour and ensured that no household was entirely beyond scrutiny. Thus, even as their work in hygiene and domestic care was hidden, their voices shaped the visible life of the village. Gossip was not a trivial pastime, but a form of governance, a way of enforcing norms and protecting households from disruption. For women with limited official power, it was one of the most effective tools they possessed. In villages where resources were scarce, reputations fragile, and authority unevenly applied, knowing what others were saying and shaping what they said in return was a way to navigate risk. Housewives, who bore much of the responsibility for sustaining households, could not afford to ignore the power of words. Information exchanged at the well or in the fields was not always idle commentary. It could provide warning of danger or opportunity. If a household was rumoured to be harbouring illness, women might quietly steer their children away from contact, long before any priest or official acknowledged the spread of disease. If a neighbour was said to have a surplus of grain hidden in storage, that knowledge might guide subtle negotiations or requests for loans. Gossip transmitted not only reputational judgments but practical intelligence that could determine whether a family endured lean times or fell into crisis. Survival through gossip also meant protection against exploitation. In a society where many women had little recourse to formal justice, the threat of reputation could act as a shield. A husband known for violence might find his behaviour whispered about until it became common knowledge, reducing his ability to act without scrutiny. A merchant attempting to cheat a village woman in a trade could quickly acquire a bad name, weakening his influence in the local market. Even when direct confrontation was too risky, the slow spread of words allowed women to defend themselves indirectly. This survival function extended into matters of morality and law. Adultery, theft, and heresy were all charges that could bring severe punishment. Yet, gossip often functioned as the first line of both accusation and defence. A woman accused of improper behaviour might rely on her neighbours to speak on her behalf, insisting through their conversations that the story was exaggerated or false. Conversely, silence from the community could leave her vulnerable, as failure to defend her reputation allowed suspicion to harden into belief. In this way, gossip was not just an individual practice, but a collective mechanism through which households either reinforced or abandoned one another. Court records provide a window into how seriously gossip was taken. Women were often named as witnesses in defamation suits, not because they held formal power, but because their voices carried weight in shaping communal judgment. A handful of women declaring that someone was known to be honest, diligent, or faithful could alter the course of a dispute. Likewise, when women repeated tales of misbehaviour, those stories could become evidence in themselves. The blurred line between rumour and fact gave gossip enormous influence, and housewives learned to wield it carefully. For many women, gossip also served as a strategy of alignment, choosing sides in conflicts to ensure their households were on the safer path. Aligning with powerful neighbours or influential families through the sharing of supportive stories could secure protection. Conversely, distancing oneself through critical whispers could signal disapproval without open defiance. This ability to place the household within broader networks of support and suspicion was crucial in communities where isolation could mean vulnerability. It is important to remember that gossip was not always voluntary. Women were often expected to participate in these exchanges to demonstrate loyalty or attentiveness. Failing to contribute information could itself raise questions. Was she hiding something? Was her silence an attempt to shield her family from scrutiny? In this way, gossip functioned almost like a currency. One could not always withdraw from its circulation. Participation was often necessary to remain integrated into the community. At the same time, this necessity highlights how gossip could become double-edged. While it protected households, it also placed them in constant exposure to judgment. A woman had to navigate carefully, weighing what to reveal and what to withhold. Revealing too much could endanger her family, while withholding entirely could isolate her. The ability to balance these risks was a skill learned not from formal teaching, but from daily practice, shaped by the successes and failures of neighbours before her. Ultimately, gossip in medieval villages was more than background chatter. It was an informal system of communication that operated in the absence of reliable authorities, offering both protection and peril. For housewives, it provided a way to anticipate threats, secure alliances, and shield their families from harm. Their survival strategies depended not only on the food they produced or the clothes they mended, but also on the words they spoke and the whispers they allowed to circulate. In this sense, gossip was as much a tool of survival as the spindle or the cooking pot. It was intangible, invisible, and often overlooked in official accounts. But for the women who managed households in uncertain times, it was indispensable. It offered warning, defence, and leverage in a world where their formal power was limited, but their voices were always present. The same words that shielded a household one day could endanger it the next. Speaking too freely in a medieval village, where ears were always open and stories travelled quickly, was a dangerous game. Housewives in particular had to learn when to hold their tongues, for while they could gain influence through conversation, they could also lose everything if their words reached the wrong listener. The danger lay partly in the way gossip blurred into accusation. A casual remark made at the well might not remain casual for long. If repeated enough, or if heard by someone with reason to take offence, it could escalate into a matter for the manor court or even the church. In a society where honour and reputation were central to social standing, words carried weight. To be accused of slander could mean fines, public humiliation, or lasting suspicion. Court rolls from England, France, and the Low Countries reveal numerous cases of women summoned because their tongues had been too sharp or their stories too reckless. But the risks extended far beyond formal punishment. Gossip could stir feuds between families or create rifts that lasted generations. An unguarded comment about a neighbour's honesty, marriage or property might cause more than just embarrassment. It could fuel anger strong enough to lead to retaliation. In a world where communities were tightly knit and options for moving away were limited, such enmities could trap families in cycles of hostility that were difficult to escape. Housewives, often at the centre of these exchanges, were painfully aware that a single misjudged word could set off a chain of consequences. The church also played a role in amplifying these risks. Gossip was frequently denounced in sermons as sinful, a form of idleness or even malice that could lead souls astray. Preachers warned that the tongue was a dangerous instrument, capable of spreading lies and discord. Women, already seen as more prone to talk, were often singled out as particularly susceptible to this vice. This cultural framing meant that a woman known for talking too much could easily be branded not just troublesome but morally suspect. Once that impression took hold, her influence diminished and her family might bear the stain of her reputation. Even more perilous was the way gossip could intersect with accusations of witchcraft or heresy. A woman who spoke too openly about remedies, secrets or suspicions could find herself the subject of darker rumours. A neighbour might repeat her words in a different light, suggesting she knew too much about herbs or had spoken against the church. Once a reputation for dangerous speech began, it was almost impossible to reverse. Many women accused of witchcraft in the later Middle Ages were not outsiders but ordinary housewives whose words had drawn too much attention. Another layer of danger lay in the imbalance of power. Men could speak boldly in taverns or marketplaces without attracting the same level of scrutiny. Women, however, had fewer protections. If their words offended a powerful neighbour, there were limited avenues to defend themselves. Their speech could be twisted or misrepresented, and without strong allies, they might find themselves isolated. This vulnerability forced many women to calculate carefully not just what they said, but to whom and in what setting. Survival, then, depended on discretion. Successful housewives became adept at reading situations, knowing when to join in, when to deflect, and when to remain silent. Silence itself could be a form of communication, signalling disapproval or withholding endorsement, without the risk of direct confrontation. But silence, too, carried its dangers, for it could be interpreted as agreement or concealment. Navigating these ambiguities required constant judgment, and the stakes were high. The broader danger of speaking too much was that words once released could not be recalled. Medieval people understood this well. A story might take on a life of its own, twisted in retelling, reshaped by those with different interests. By the time it circled back, the speaker's original meaning might be unrecognizable, yet she would still be held accountable. For this reason, many women learn to speak in hints, half-truths, or vague observations, keeping themselves distant from the sharp edges of outright accusation. In the end, gossip's power cut both ways. It offered protection, influence, and knowledge, but it also exposed women to risks they could not fully control. The dangers of speaking too much were not theoretical. They were lived realities, reinforced by the fear of courts, the authority of the church, and the memory of ruined reputations. For medieval housewives, discretion was not only a virtue preached from the pulpit, but a necessity woven into daily survival. Their voices mattered, but every word carried a price. A housewife who knew something valuable and who offered it carefully to the right person might gain allies strong enough to protect her family in times of trouble. Secrets, in this sense, were not just whispered gossip. They were commodities exchanged in an unspoken marketplace of trust, fear, and obligation. Protection often meant aligning with those who had more power. A wife who passed along news about a neighbour's brewing disputes, or who hinted at a rival family's debts, could find herself in the good graces of a reeve, bailiff, or local landholder. These figures, tasked with keeping order, valued informants who kept them aware of the village undercurrents. By sharing carefully chosen fragments of knowledge, a woman could establish herself as useful. In return, she and her household might receive leniency in matters of rent, taxes, or disputes. This exchange was not always formal or overt. Sometimes it unfolded in the quiet language of favours and memory. A whispered warning about a brewing quarrel, shared with a priest or influential neighbour, created a sense of indebtedness. The recipient of that knowledge owed something in return, even if it was only a willingness to overlook a later fault or to defend the woman's name in a moment of accusation. Within these small but significant negotiations, women carved out a layer of security that went beyond the physical walls of their homes. Secrets also functioned as insurance in conflicts between families. If a housewife found herself caught in the tension of village feuds, she might hold back key information until the right moment, revealing it in a way that made her indispensable. For example, knowledge about a land boundary dispute or the private dealings of a wealthier household could be wielded strategically. In a world where written records were scarce and memory carried weight, those who controlled the flow of information held leverage. This leverage could mean the difference between being silenced in a court case and having a voice. Not all exchanges of secrets took place with authority figures. Protection could also be built within networks of other women. Housewives often relied on each other in practical and emotional ways, sharing food, labour, and advice. But trust in these relationships was often cemented through the exchange of private knowledge. A woman who confided something sensitive to another did not simply reveal vulnerability. She created a bond that obligated the other to keep her confidence. In turn, that secrecy might be repaid later with support, defense against a rumor, or help in concealing a personal matter. In a community where exposure could be devastating, these bonds acted as mutual safeguards. Of course, this practice had limits. A secret given too freely lost its value, while one held too tightly could turn into a liability if others discovered it first. Women had to calculate carefully when to share, what to reveal, and how much to withhold. The art of secrecy lay in the balance, enough to create obligation, but not so much that one's own household became vulnerable. It was a delicate skill, learned through experience and sharpened by necessity. At times, the line between protection and manipulation was thin. A woman might reveal another's fault not to harm her, but to ensure her own safety by demonstrating loyalty to a higher authority. In this sense, secrets became both weapon and shield, blurring the moral boundaries of friendship and enmity. The one who traded information might save her household from scrutiny, but at the cost of another family's reputation. Such choices reflected the harsh realities of survival in communities where resources were scarce and social standing fragile. The danger, of course, was that a secret once spoken could never fully be recalled. The woman who exchanged it gained protection in the moment, but she also risked entangling herself in future disputes. If her role as an informant became too obvious, she might lose the very protection she sought, marked instead as untrustworthy. This precarious balance meant that secrecy was not simply about silence, but about strategy, how to speak, when to speak, and when to remain carefully mute. In the end, the exchange of secrets for protection reveals the quiet political world of medieval households. Far from passive observers, housewives navigated a web of obligations, alliances and dangers, often through nothing more than words spoken in confidence. Their ability to handle knowledge, whether to keep it, trade it or deploy it, shaped not only their reputations but their household's safety. Information in this context was power, and in the hands of women who had few other tools of influence, it became one of the most important means of survival. Just as information was managed with care, so too were prayers, rituals and tokens of devotion. Religion permeated every layer of medieval life, but the official ceremonies of the church did not always meet the private needs of the household. Behind closed doors, housewives and their families often practiced a more intimate, sometimes secretive form of piety that existed alongside the sanctioned teachings of priests. Private prayers were among the most common expressions of this hidden religiosity. While church attendance was expected and confession mandatory, individuals frequently turned to whispered prayers within the home for immediate comfort. Housewives might murmur petitions while stirring a pot, weaving linen, or watching over children at night. These words were rarely formal or memorized liturgy. Instead, they blended fragments of the familiar Latin prayers heard in church with local dialect, personal pleas, and protective invocations. A mother might pray for a child's fever to break, a husband's safe return from the fields, or protection from sudden misfortune. These private utterances gave her a sense of agency, allowing her to act within the confines of a religious system that otherwise gave her little authority. Alongside private prayers, households often kept relics or devotional items hidden from the public eye. Not every family could afford official relics sanctioned by the church, but the hunger for tangible signs of divine protection was widespread. As a result, objects took on sacred significance, whether or not they had clerical approval. A splinter of wood said to be from a holy tree, a pebble taken from a shrine, or even a strip of cloth touched to a saint's statue could be treasured as a family's shield against danger. Housewives in particular became guardians of these objects, tucking them into chests, embedding them in wall niches, or sewing them discreetly into garments. Some of these relics were tolerated, even encouraged by the church, while others risked being condemned as superstition. Yet the boundary between acceptable devotion and heretical practice was often blurry. For many women, the possession of a small charm or relic was not an act of rebellion but of necessity. In a world where illness struck suddenly, childbirth remained perilous, and crops could fail without warning, the presence of a protective token offered reassurance. It was not enough to rely on distant priests or irregular sacraments. Households wanted immediate, tangible ways to anchor their faith. These hidden relics also carried social meaning. Passing them down from mother to daughter reinforced both continuity and secrecy within families. A piece of cloth said to have healed an ancestor's sickness became more than a religious object. It became an heirloom, proof of both survival and divine favour. To share it outside the family would risk both ridicule and theft, so these items were guarded closely, their existence known only to trusted relatives. Housewives who oversaw the household's material and spiritual well-being ensured their preservation. The secrecy of such practices mirrored the discretion women used in other areas of life. Just as they learned when to share gossip or conceal household strategies, they also knew when to reveal their prayers and relics. A whispered petition might be voiced aloud in the company of a child or neighbour if it could inspire faith, but more often it remained confined to the privacy of a kitchen hearth or bedside. Likewise, relics might be displayed only in moments of crisis, a serious illness, a difficult birth, or a looming storm, before being hidden again in the folds of fabric or the shadow of a cupboard. The tension between public and private devotion reflected a broader reality of medieval religion. The church provided the framework, but individual households adapted it to their needs. Priests might preach obedience and warn against superstition, but in practice, people often relied on personal rituals and objects to feel spiritually secure. This was not necessarily a rejection of the church, rather it was an attempt to fill the gaps left by formal ceremonies. A Sunday Mass could not soothe a crying infant at midnight, nor could a distant bishop protect a household from sudden death. For that, families turned inward, into their own words, their own relics, their own quiet faith. The fact that these practices were often concealed highlights the risks involved. To be seen as too reliant on charms or home rituals could invite suspicion of heresy or witchcraft, yet to abandon them entirely was unthinkable for many. Thus, private prayers and hidden relics existed in a fragile balance, sustaining belief in ways that were both deeply personal and quietly defiant. They remind us that religion in the Middle Ages was not only about cathedrals and sermons, but also about whispered words and small objects, treasured and tucked away in the dim corners of households where women held watch. The private prayers and hidden relics of the medieval home often placed housewives in a role that went far beyond managing food, children, and household order. They became, in effect, the quiet spiritual leaders of their families. This leadership was rarely acknowledged in official terms and almost never recorded in formal accounts, but it shaped how religion was lived out day to day. Where the parish priest governed the sacraments and the cycle of church festivals, it was the housewife who maintained the daily rhythm of faith within the walls of her home. This authority grew from necessity. Priests were not always present in villages, particularly in remote areas where one cleric might serve several parishes. Even when they were available, they were not part of the intimate fabric of household life. Families still faced illnesses, fears, disputes and anxieties that required immediate spiritual guidance. In these moments, the housewife was the one to step in. She was the figure who ensured that prayers were said at night, that the sick were soothed with both remedies and religious words, and that the home was marked with tokens of protection. The ability to combine domestic labour with spiritual reassurance made her indispensable. Her leadership was not formal, but it was recognised within the family. Children learned their first prayers at their mother's side, often long before they could attend church services or understand Latin sermons. Mothers instructed them in signs of the cross, blessings before meals, and whispered petitions during storms or illnesses. In this way, housewives became transmitters of religious knowledge. While men might attend village councils or stand in the fields, women shaped the faith of the next generation through repetition, ritual and memory. Beyond children, housewives also influenced their husbands and relatives. A wife who quietly lit a candle before an image of the Virgin Mary, or who encouraged the household to observe small fasting practices, demonstrated both discipline and devotion. In moments of crisis, her presence as a spiritual guide could calm the household and provide a sense of order when external structures seemed distant or uncertain. The church emphasised male authority, yet within the household, women exercised a form of spiritual influence that often went unchallenged because it was framed as care rather than command. One area where this leadership was especially evident was in managing religious objects and practices within the home. Housewives oversaw the care of devotional books, if a family possessed one, and made sure holy water was obtained when available. They might arrange makeshift altars, place herbs or relics in spaces considered vulnerable, or lead prayers during the long absences of clergy. Even something as simple as remembering feast days or incorporating saintly stories into daily life gave them an authority rooted in memory and continuity. These small acts accumulated into a spiritual framework that guided households through uncertainty. This quiet leadership, however, was not without risk. The line between accepted devotion and condemned superstition was thin, and women who appeared to wield too much spiritual authority could be viewed with suspicion. A housewife who insisted too strongly on her remedies, relics, or private prayers might face accusations of stepping beyond her role, especially if outcomes were unfavourable. Illnesses that worsened despite her efforts could lead to whispers of blame. Yet most families depended on this unacknowledged authority too deeply to openly challenge it, unless tensions or external pressures forced the matter. Still, the reliance on housewives as spiritual leaders points to the gaps in medieval religious life. The church sought to regulate devotion through priests, bishops, and official rituals, but ordinary people needed faith to be practical and immediate. Women filled this gap, often invisibly, in kitchens, hearths, and bedrooms. They prayed over infants too weak to nurse, placed protective charms at thresholds, and taught children that even in the absence of a priest, the family could still call on divine protection. Their authority was exercised not through sermons, but through presence, persistence, and care. What emerges, then, is a picture of religion that was both formal and informal, public and private. The church set the boundaries, but inside the home, women guided faith in ways that responded to daily realities. They were not saints or scholars, but they shaped belief through lived practice. Their influence was not written in canon law, but it lingered in the prayers of their children, the routines of their households, and the objects they kept hidden in cupboards or stitched into clothing. In this sense, housewives were not only managers of the material world, but also guardians of the spiritual one. The idea of women as quiet, spiritual leaders underscores the extent to which medieval households balanced between official doctrine and personal need. Their leadership was necessary, discreet, and often veiled, but it was effective. Without them, much of the everyday continuity of faith would have faltered. And just as relics were hidden in chests and whispered prayers spoken in corners, so too was this leadership carried out, unseen but essential. If housewives often guided their families in quiet faith, they also navigated the silences of that same faith. One of the most striking silences was found in confession. The medieval church placed enormous weight on the sacrament of penance. From the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 onward, it was mandatory for Christians to confess their sins at least once a year. Priests emphasized confession as a doorway to absolution, a way to keep the soul free from damnation. Yet in practice, many people, women especially, chose to keep parts of their lives hidden from the ears of their parish priests. The reasons for withholding confessions were varied. Some were rooted in fear. A housewife might worry that confessing certain acts, whether using a charm to cure a child's fever, muttering a forbidden prayer, or concealing a bit of money from her husband, would bring punishment instead of forgiveness. Priests were not always sympathetic listeners. They could lecture, impose public penance, or, in some cases, report suspicious practices to ecclesiastical authorities. In small villages where everyone knew each other, the risk of being marked as a sinner or even a heretic was not easily dismissed. Others withheld confessions because of shame. Certain acts, especially those tied to sexuality or household disputes, carried deep embarrassment. A woman might admit to impatience or gossip, but she might not reveal that she had taken part in an affair, used contraceptive methods, or engaged in what the church considered impure practices to regulate fertility. To speak such things aloud, even behind the veil of the confessional, felt unbearable. Silence became the easier choice, even if it left a lingering sense of spiritual unease. Practical considerations also shaped this silence. Priests often asked probing questions, especially about sins the church considered dangerous, heresy, witchcraft, or sexual immorality. For many housewives, the risk of being misunderstood was too great. What might have been an ordinary household remedy could be misinterpreted as sorcery. A private argument with a husband could be twisted into a charge of rebellion or disobedience. Faced with this, some women developed strategies. They confessed minor faults, unkind words, laziness in chores, impatience with children, while leaving the more consequential or ambiguous actions unspoken. This selective confession allowed them to fulfill their religious duty while protecting themselves from judgment. The act of withholding confessions also reveals the tension between official religion and lived religion. The Church envisioned itself as the mediator between humanity and God, with priests serving as essential gatekeepers. But in daily life, individuals often shaped their own moral boundaries, deciding which sins truly required absolution and which could be left between themselves and God. Housewives, in particular, seemed to carve out a private space where conscience mattered more than priestly authority. Their decisions about what to confess reflected both practicality and self-preservation. This silence was not necessarily a rejection of faith. Most who withheld confessions still participated in church life, attended Mass, and raised their families within Christian traditions. The silence instead points to the limits of institutional control. Faith for these women was lived in layers, the public face of piety shown in church and the private negotiations of morality within the home. Confession became another place where these layers met and sometimes conflicted. There was also an element of strategy in withheld confessions. Just as gossip could be used as shield or weapon in village life, silence in confession could serve as protection. By choosing what not to say, housewives preserved their reputations, safeguarded their households, and kept dangerous knowledge away from clerical scrutiny. This discretion mirrored the other hidden roles they played: healers, traders, managers of household secrets. Silence in confession was another form of survival. Priests themselves may have suspected these omissions. Manuals for confessors from the late Middle Ages warned clergy to ask careful, detailed questions, especially of women, whom the Church often associated with temptation and error. Yet even these efforts could not force full disclosure. The balance of power was not entirely one-sided. A priest might have authority, but he could not see into a woman's mind. She alone decided what words to release and which to hold back. In this way, confession became another site where medieval housewives exercised agency in subtle but significant ways. They did not defy the Church openly. They fulfilled their obligations, at least on the surface. But in their silences, they retained control over their own narratives, their own morality, and their own survival. What remained unspoken may have weighed on their consciences, but it also shielded them from judgment and preserved the fragile stability of their lives. The act of withholding confessions highlights the complexity of religious life in the Middle Ages. It was not simply a matter of obedience to doctrine, but of constant negotiation between faith, fear, and practical necessity. Just as housewives guided their families in prayer, taught children rituals, and kept relics safe in cupboards, they also shaped their spiritual lives through what they chose not to reveal. Their silence was not absence. It was a deliberate choice, a form of quiet power exercised in the most intimate of religious settings. In the late Middle Ages especially, there was often only a thin and shifting line between what the Church praised as devotion and what it condemned as dangerous. Piety and heresy sometimes looked remarkably similar, leaving housewives and ordinary villagers to walk a narrow path between reverence and suspicion. This tension was partly rooted in the Church's desire to regulate all expressions of faith. Official doctrine encouraged prayer, fasting, the veneration of saints, and the use of holy relics. But at the same time, local traditions often blurred into practices that clerics regarded with suspicion. A housewife who kept a bone fragment, a holy medal, or a sprig of herbs said to have protective power might see it as part of her devotion. Yet a priest could just as easily label it superstition or even heresy if it seemed to replace trust in God with faith in objects or rituals. The problem was that ordinary people rarely drew sharp distinctions. For them, religion was woven into the rhythms of daily life. A whispered prayer over a sick child, a candle lit before a family crucifix, or a charm hung above the bed were acts of care as much as acts of faith. Housewives in particular lived in this world of blurred boundaries, where practical remedies overlapped with spiritual ones. A poultice of herbs could be both medicine and blessing. A charm muttered over livestock could be both superstition and prayer. These were not acts of rebellion against the Church, but efforts to bring divine protection into the fragile spaces of home and family. The Church, however, often sought to police these margins. By the 14th century, clerical authorities were increasingly alert to heresy, especially after movements like the Cathars or the Lollards challenged church teaching. Women who spoke too confidently about religious visions or who seemed to interpret scripture for themselves risked being accused of stepping beyond the role of lay devotion. Housewives might not have intended to defy authority, but their actions could nonetheless attract suspicion if they strayed outside the boundaries of approved practice. At the same time, local priests varied in how strictly they enforced these boundaries. Some tolerated the blending of custom and faith, recognizing that herbal charms or whispered prayers were part of a community's fabric. Others, however, were harsher, eager to stamp out anything that smelled of superstition. A woman's private practices might be ignored for years until suddenly a change in leadership or a local crisis made them appear threatening. The danger was not always abstract. Records from inquisitorial courts in places like France, Italy, and later Germany show how women's acts of devotion could be twisted into accusations. A woman who claimed to heal with prayers and herbs might be celebrated as a local helper one year, then denounced as a witch the next. What had once been interpreted as piety could, under new scrutiny, be redefined as heresy. The consequences of such a shift could be severe: penance, public shame, or even death in the harshest periods of witch persecution. This uncertainty bred caution. Housewives often practiced their faith quietly, avoiding attention while still clinging to the rituals and beliefs that gave them comfort. Silence, again, became a form of protection. Just as they withheld certain confessions, they also concealed certain practices, passing them privately within families or whispering them to trusted neighbours. These hidden devotions were less about rejecting orthodoxy and more about surviving in a system where the line between holy and heretical could change with little warning. It is also worth remembering that the accusation of heresy was not always about religion alone. Power, gender, and local conflict often shaped how piety was judged. A woman respected in her village might be left alone in her devotions, while another, disliked or distrusted, might be targeted for the very same practices. Religion provided the language of accusation, but the roots often lay in social rivalries or economic tensions. For housewives, the risk was constant. An act of devotion that seemed safe today might tomorrow be the spark for suspicion. In this way, the spiritual lives of medieval housewives reveal the precariousness of living faith in a world where authority was rigid, yet daily life demanded flexibility. They were not theologians or rebels, but women trying to weave protection, meaning, and hope into their households. The fact that such acts could be interpreted as either piety or heresy underscores how unstable the boundaries truly were. Faith was not only a matter of devotion, but also of judgment. By priests, by neighbours, and by the unpredictable winds of history. When housewives strayed into desperate or forbidden acts, the chronicles often recorded them not as daily struggles, but as cautionary tales. Among the most striking were stories of poisonings, acts that hovered between rumour, accusation, and reality. In medieval Europe, where women's power was largely confined to the domestic sphere, poison was one of the few tools imagined as available to them. Chroniclers and court records occasionally preserve such accounts, though always coloured by suspicion. A sudden death in a household might be linked to a meal prepared by a wife. If a husband, lord, or rival fell ill, whispers of poison could spread even before the cause was known. Medical knowledge was limited and foodborne illness was common, yet rather than blaming spoiled meat or contaminated water, communities often looked to intent. A wife with a strained marriage, a servant dismissed in anger, or a neighbour embroiled in a dispute could all be framed as likely culprits. Poison became a narrative shorthand for hidden malice. Part of this suspicion rested on the simple fact that women handled food and herbs. Housewives mixed broths, steeped teas, and prepared medicines. The same herbs that soothed pain or aided sleep, henbane, mandrake, or nightshade, could also kill if used in larger doses. Knowledge that was practical in one setting could, in another, be seen as dangerous expertise. Just as whispered prayers and charms blurred into superstition, so too did household remedies blur into accusations of poisoning. Some chronicles record dramatic tales where poison served as both plot and punishment. In Italian city-states, accusations of wives or widows poisoning rivals for inheritance appear alongside reports of political poisonings among the elite. Northern European ballads and moral tales warned against women who used their household roles to conceal murderous intentions. The very intimacy of the home, with its shared meals and close quarters, made it a natural stage for such suspicions. Yet whether these stories reflected common reality or exaggerated fear remains difficult to say. Legal records suggest that actual cases of poisoning were relatively rare. More often, the idea of poisoning expressed anxieties about women's hidden influence. Because wives were expected to be obedient and silent, any hint that they might act in secret, whether through infidelity, religious heterodoxy, or poison, could provoke outsized fear. The home, imagined as a place of trust, became threatening when secrecy turned against it. In times of crisis, such fears grew sharper. Famine, plague, or local unrest often bred accusations of poisoning, sometimes against entire groups. Foreigners, Jews, and suspected witches were all accused of contaminating wells or spreading disease. Within households, similar logic applied on a smaller scale. A woman with access to herbs, water, and food was both necessary and potentially dangerous. She could nourish or destroy. For many women, the very rumour of poisoning could be ruinous. Even without proof, the whisper could travel, staining reputations and leaving families vulnerable. A husband who fell ill after an argument with his wife might spark suspicion. A mother-in-law's death might invite scrutiny of the meals served beforehand. Courts did not always require evidence in the modern sense. Reputation, gossip, and circumstance could shape verdicts as much as physical proof. Still, it would be wrong to assume all such tales were fabricated. Desperation could indeed drive women to crime. In societies where divorce was nearly impossible, abuse common, and options few, some may have turned to poison as a final, if grim, tool. The chronicles frame these acts as moral failures, but beneath them lies a history of constrained lives and desperate measures. A woman trapped in a violent household or denied authority might find in herbs the only form of power available, power that could heal or kill. Ultimately, the stories of poisonings reflect both real dangers and cultural fears. They reveal how closely women's everyday duties, cooking, healing, and caring, were entangled with suspicions of secret harm. Chronicles magnified these tales, retelling them as lessons in morality and obedience. But for the women themselves, the line between remedy and crime was often as fragile as the line between piety and heresy. It depended on intent, perception, and above all, who had the power to tell the story. The suspicion surrounding women's knowledge of remedies extended beyond herbs and poisons. In medieval households, nearly every tool of daily life could, in the right or wrong circumstances, become an instrument of violence. Unlike swords or spears, which were the preserve of men and the battlefield, women's tools were domestic. Pestles, knives, boiling cauldrons, iron tongues from the hearth. These were not crafted as weapons, but they could serve as such when desperation demanded it. Court records occasionally reveal incidents where quarrels escalated into violence using nothing more exotic than the nearest household implement. A kitchen knife, sharp enough for butchering meat, was sometimes turned against another person. An iron poker used for stirring the fire could just as easily be swung in anger. Even heavy wooden stools or stone jars could become lethal in moments of rage or self-defense. For women with limited access to formal weapons, the objects of the home provided both opportunity and concealment. Chronicles and ballads sometimes exaggerated these events, portraying women who turned everyday items into symbols of treachery. In one account, a scorned wife was said to have invited her husband to a meal only to scold him with boiling broth, an image that lingered as a moral warning against disobedient spouses. In another, a servant girl was accused of striking her mistress with the very broom she was meant to wield in service. Whether these were factual or embellished, the tales underscored a cultural anxiety. The tools of the household, meant for order and nurture, could also harbour violence. Much of this anxiety came from the fact that such tools were ordinary and ever-present. Unlike a dagger which could be confiscated or a bow which required skill, a pot of water sat on nearly every hearth. The sheer accessibility of these items made them unpredictable in disputes. In many ways, they democratized violence. Anyone with enough strength or anger could act. For men, this possibility challenged the notion that they alone held the power of force. For women, it created a dangerous association, one that could lead to suspicion even without action. At the same time, household tools as weapons reflected the realities of women's limited choices. For wives in abusive marriages or servants trapped in hostile households, the objects of daily work might offer the only means of resistance. Striking back with a poker or knife was not simply an act of rebellion, but sometimes a matter of survival. That these cases were rare does not lessen their significance. Rather, their rarity may reflect the risks of using violence at all. A woman who defended herself with a household tool could easily be framed not as a victim, but as a criminal. The blurred line between necessity and crime is clear in judicial records. When men killed with swords, it could be excused as defence of honour or property. When women acted with pots or knives, the narrative shifted toward treachery, stealth, or unnatural defiance of gender roles. What men called courage in themselves, they often named cunning in women. This double standard meant that the same act, defending one's life or ending an oppressive relationship, was interpreted very differently depending on who held the weapon. Interestingly, some authorities recognised this tension. A few legal commentaries of the later Middle Ages noted that women could not be expected to fight with traditional arms. If they fought at all, it was with what was at hand. Yet this recognition did not always lessen the severity of judgment. Instead, it reinforced the idea that the household itself, the domain of women, was a site of hidden danger. To turn tools of care into tools of harm was, in the eyes of moralists, to invert the natural order. But the very persistence of such stories reveals that these incidents captured something deeper about medieval life. The household was not merely a passive backdrop, but an active arena where struggles for power played out. Women, constrained by obedience and dependence, sometimes used the objects of their environment to assert control in moments of conflict. Whether or not they truly did so often mattered less than the fear that they could. In the end, the transformation of household tools into weapons symbolised broader anxieties about women's hidden capacities. Just as whispered remedies could be recast as poison, so could kitchen knives and hearth tongs be seen as potential instruments of rebellion. The chronicles that preserved these tales often did so not to record everyday life faithfully, but to remind their readers of the dangers lurking behind closed doors. For women, the presence of these tools was a double-edged reality, indispensable for daily survival, but also forever shadowed by the possibility of suspicion, violence, and accusation. If household tools could turn into weapons of desperation, so too could the quiet skills of everyday survival slide into forms of theft, fraud, and deception. These were not always the dramatic crimes recorded in chronicles with lurid detail, but rather the small and calculated acts that kept households afloat in hard times. For women in particular, whose legal and economic options were often restricted, bending or breaking the rules of honesty was sometimes the only way to stretch resources or assert a measure of control. Court rolls from medieval England, France and Germany show frequent cases of women accused of pilfering food, small goods or textiles. Unlike men who were often tried for larger-scale theft of livestock or property, women's thefts tended to be items they had direct access to: eggs, ale, firewood or scraps of cloth. These were not luxuries, but things that fed children, mended clothing or warmed a hearth. In communities where survival hinged on these basics, the line between necessity and crime blurred easily. A missing loaf of bread could mean theft, but it could also mean a hungry mother trying to keep her family alive. Fraud, too, could creep into the realm of the household. Alewives in particular were notorious targets of complaint, accused of diluting their brew with water or charging more than the official price. Guild and court records often singled out women in this role, partly because brewing was a common occupation for housewives, and partly because it made them visible in public markets. Whether every accusation was true is less certain. Some may have been rooted in genuine deceit, while others were fueled by resentment or rivalry. Regardless, such charges reflect how the practical skill of stretching resources could be reframed as criminal deceit in the eyes of neighbours and officials. Deception also appeared in subtler forms, Women might feign illness to delay debts, conceal the true size of a household's stores, or disguise inferior goods as better quality. In some cases, they acted as accomplices in their husbands' dealings, helping to falsify weights or hide items during inspections. At other times, they acted independently, using small lies to guard household security. These were not the crimes of ambitious swindlers, but rather the calculated manoeuvres of people navigating systems stacked against them. The language used to describe such acts often reveals more about cultural anxieties than the acts themselves. Men who cheated in trade were often condemned for greed, while women were accused of cunning, slyness, or witch-like deception. The same behaviours that were tolerated, even admired, in male merchants could be treated as dangerous subversions when performed by women. It was less the act of deceit itself that unsettled neighbours, and more the idea that women, expected to be obedient and transparent, might wield secrecy as a weapon. Punishments varied, but women often paid a heavier price for these small crimes. Public shaming was common. The cucking stool for dishonest alewives, fines for petty theft, or even flogging in markets. Yet these punishments did not eliminate the behaviour, because the circumstances that drove it remained. A household without enough food, firewood or coin would continue to push its members toward risks. Theft and fraud were not moral failings so much as strategies of survival within a fragile economy. At the same time, communities sometimes turned a blind eye. A poor widow taking a bundle of sticks from the Lord's forest might be quietly tolerated if her neighbours recognised her need. Theft was condemned in principle, but in practice it could be overlooked when it did not threaten the broader order. What truly alarmed communities was not the survival theft of the poor, but the possibility of disorder, when too many bent rules at once, or when someone's deceit undermined trust on a larger scale. In this sense, survival crimes expose the deep tension between communal values and individual desperation. Everyone knew that hunger and hardship could drive dishonesty, but they also feared the erosion of trust that held small villages together. Housewives in particular occupied a precarious position, entrusted with managing resources, but judged harshly if they strayed into dishonesty. Their quiet acts of theft or deceit were simultaneously understood and condemned, tolerated and punished. Thus, when we speak of theft, fraud and deception in the medieval household, we are not looking at the crimes of hardened criminals. We are seeing the shadow side of survival, where necessity blurred into illegality, and where the skills of managing a household could easily be reinterpreted as tricks or schemes. Just as household tools could be turned into weapons, so could daily resourcefulness slip into acts labelled as crime. For women, these survival strategies carried risks not only of punishment, but of lasting reputations as untrustworthy, deceitful, or even dangerous. And those reputations, once fixed, could follow them long after the crime itself had been forgotten. Housewives who stepped into these shadows lived with the knowledge that their acts could be uncovered at any time, not only by local officials, but by watchful neighbours. Exposure was often as devastating as the punishment itself. For a woman's reputation, once damaged, was rarely restored. What might have begun as a desperate attempt to feed a child or patch a leaking roof could end in humiliation, fines, or worse, being marked as untrustworthy in a world where trust was the foundation of survival. Legal records across medieval Europe reveal how communities dealt with petty crime and deceit. For women, the punishments were not always about financial restitution, but about making an example. Alewives found guilty of short measures might be dragged to the cucking stool, publicly dunked in water as a symbol of their dishonesty. A woman caught stealing food could be paraded through the village, her crime announced aloud for all to hear. These punishments were not just about justice, they were about spectacle. Public shame reminded others of the risks of crossing boundaries, and for women especially, it underscored their vulnerability to exposure. The fear of being caught did not only come from formal authorities. Neighbours, relatives and fellow market-goers often played the role of watchdogs. In villages where everyone's lives overlapped, small irregularities were quickly noticed. A woman suddenly able to buy better fabric or provide extra food at her table might raise questions about how she acquired it. Gossip could act as the first form of accusation, and once suspicion took root, it was difficult to shake. Even without formal charges, a whispered rumour of dishonesty could taint a household's reputation for years. The tension lay in how deeply women were trusted to manage households and how quickly that trust could collapse. A housewife who stole or deceived risked losing not only her standing, but her ability to negotiate within her community. Trust was currency in a world without secure contracts or banks. If people no longer believed in her honesty, she might find herself cut off from lending circles, excluded from markets, or abandoned in times of need. Exposure was not just about punishment in the moment, it was about social exile. The threat of corporal punishment was also very real. While some petty crimes ended in fines or public humiliation, others could escalate. Repeat offenders or those judged as unrepentant might face harsher penalties, including whipping, branding, or imprisonment. The fear of physical suffering hung over every act of dishonesty. In a system that relied heavily on example and deterrence, punishments were often designed to be unforgettable, ensuring that the memory of a woman's crime lingered as long as her scars or the gossip attached to her name. Yet perhaps the greater fear came not from the law, but from within the household itself. If a woman's secret theft or deceit was uncovered by her husband, the consequences could be deeply personal. Husbands were legally empowered to discipline their wives, and a woman accused of bringing shame or danger to the household might suffer violence or abandonment. The marriage bond did not shield her from exposure. In many cases, it increased her vulnerability. If she was caught, she not only risked communal punishment, but also domestic retaliation. Fear also extended into the spiritual realm. For the devout, sins of deceit and theft threatened more than earthly punishment. They jeopardized the soul. Women who lived with these secrets often did so under a cloud of religious anxiety. Confession could cleanse them, but it also carried the danger of exposure, since priests might urge restitution or reveal the seriousness of the sin. Remaining silent risked eternal consequences, while speaking could unravel their lives on earth. The tension between earthly survival and heavenly judgment was an ever-present burden. This constant fear shaped behaviour as much as need did. Some women limited their acts of dishonesty, keeping them small and infrequent so as not to draw attention. Others carefully chose moments when oversight was weakest, harvest festivals, crowded markets, or late-night hours. Still others relied on networks of kin and allies who might conceal their acts or vouch for their honesty. But beneath these strategies, the awareness of risk never disappeared. Survival through theft or fraud was always balanced against the dread of being seen, named, and punished. In this way, the fear of punishment and exposure becomes central to understanding women's hidden crimes. They were not reckless rebels against the system, but cautious participants in a dangerous game, always calculating whether the benefit outweighed the potential ruin. The smallest misstep could unravel years of careful reputation building, leaving them branded as cheats, sinners, or outcasts. And that fear, as much as the desperation that drove them to act, defined the hidden world of housewives who lived at the edges of the law. Daughters did not grow up untouched by these quiet negotiations of survival. From a young age, they absorbed not only the visible routines of spinning, brewing, and baking, but also the unspoken lessons whispered in kitchens or signalled through gestures. Much of this teaching was not written down, nor was it meant for outsiders. It was a parallel education, one that prepared daughters to inherit both the burdens and the strategies of their mothers. Household duties provided the perfect cover for this transmission of hidden traditions. When a girl sat beside her mother combing out wool, she was also learning how to recognise when a neighbour's words could be trusted. When she helped gather herbs, she was taught which ones were useful for cooking, which could ease a fever, and which were best left unnamed. These lessons were folded seamlessly into ordinary tasks, so that they seemed natural rather than deliberate. But in truth, they were part of a lineage of survival skills that stretched far beyond the obvious chores of the home. Silence was often as much up to teacher as speech. Mothers demonstrated rather than explained the importance of keeping secrets. A daughter might notice how her mother's tone softened when speaking in public about family affairs, compared to the sharper honesty reserved for private walls. She might see a debt paid quietly without witnesses, or observe her mother carefully measuring ale so as not to draw suspicion. In these moments, girls learned that discretion was as important as skill. The ability to keep one's mouth closed could determine whether a family maintained its good name or risked exposure. These hidden teachings also carried moral complexities. A girl might be shown how to stretch bread with filigranes or water ale to make it last longer, all while hearing reminders that honesty was expected in church and marriage. She was expected to reconcile these contradictions, to understand that survival sometimes required bending rules, even while maintaining outward appearances of virtue. In this way, daughters inherited not only skills but also the double vision necessary to live in a world that demanded obedience yet rewarded cunning. The transmission of remedies was one of the clearest examples of this hidden inheritance. Mothers passed down recipes for poultices, teas, or ointments, sometimes framing them as simple household tips, other times warning their daughters never to mention them outside the family. A cure for stomach pains might be explained as harmless, while another herb mixture would come with cautionary words about accusations of witchcraft. Girls learned early that knowledge itself could be dangerous depending on who was watching and when it was used. These warnings were not idle. They reflected centuries of lived risk, where women's wisdom could be celebrated in private, but condemned in public. Marriage often interrupted this education, but it did not end it. A daughter leaving her family home carried with her not only linens and dowry goods, but also the weight of her mother's quiet instructions. She might not repeat them openly to her new household, but they guided her decisions as she navigated her own challenges. In this way, knowledge that was never written into books or acknowledged by men's records continued to circulate, shaping the daily survival strategies of countless women across generations. This hidden inheritance also reinforced continuity within families. Daughters who had been raised in households where gossip was carefully managed often continued the practice, ensuring that their children too would know when to speak and when to remain silent. A family's reputation could rest on such continuity. Even if individual acts of theft, deception, or resistance faded into memory, the underlying skill of secrecy remained, passed from mother to daughter like an heirloom. The result was a cycle in which silence, caution, and hidden strength became part of women's collective memory. What one generation had learned under the threat of exposure, the next inherited as common sense. These traditions were not celebrated in songs or chronicled in court records. They lived instead in the quiet exchanges between mothers and daughters, embedded in gestures, warnings, and unspoken understandings. And so, even as the fear of punishment loomed large in women's lives, they ensured that their daughters would enter adulthood with tools to endure the same pressures. These daughters were not shielded from the harshness of their world. They were prepared for it. The secrecy their mothers had cultivated became the daughters' inheritance, ensuring that the hidden world of housewives did not end with one generation but continued, reshaped, and relearned for centuries. If daughters inherited secrecy as a skill, much of that secrecy revolved around the preservation of family honour. In a medieval village, reputation was as valuable as land or livestock. Families without wealth or status could still maintain standing through respectability, while families with resources could see them diminished by scandal. Women were often placed at the centre of this balancing act, for it was within the walls of the household that honour could be upheld or quietly undermined. Housewives learned early that silence was one of the strongest shields against shame. If a husband drank too heavily or squandered money, a wife might downplay his faults when speaking with neighbours. If food stores ran low, she might claim they were saving for a festival rather than admit to hardship. Such concealments were not merely personal choices, but strategies that protected the family's position within the community. To admit too much risked gossip, and gossip could spiral into social isolation, church discipline, or even legal trouble. Family honour was also tied to the conduct of daughters. A girl's reputation reflected directly upon her household, which meant mothers carried the burden of concealing improprieties. If a daughter had been seen in the wrong company, A mother might invent excuses about errands or kinship ties. If a child was born suspiciously early after marriage, explanations would be offered, sometimes supported by discreet midwives who knew when to look away. These acts of concealment were not framed as deceit in the women's minds, but as necessary measures to shield the family from lasting disgrace. At the same time, honour was a currency negotiated daily in matters of work and trade. A woman who sold ale or cloth had to ensure her product was considered reliable. If a batch soured, she might quietly water it down or blame the barrel, protecting her reputation as an honest seller even when circumstances were difficult. Households depended on repeat customers, and thus women's ability to maintain appearances was as important as their ability to brew or weave. The concealment of flaws became an expected part of maintaining one's standing. Religion reinforced these concerns. The church placed strong emphasis on chastity, honesty, and obedience. Yet its very demands made concealment more necessary. Confession was supposed to lay bare sins, but many women chose their words carefully, offering generalities rather than specific truths. They feared not only divine judgment, but also the possibility that rumours might spread if priests or neighbours suspected scandal. The concealment of family failings, then, was presented as both practical and moral, a way to protect loved ones from shame and punishment alike. The boundaries of what needed to be hidden could extend far beyond obvious missteps. A wife might conceal the extent of her husband's debts, or the fact that she had pawned a household tool to buy grain. She might downplay a quarrel with neighbours, or keep quiet about illnesses in the home that could draw suspicion of contagion. The family's survival depended not just on what they did, but on what others believed about them. To manage those beliefs was one of the housewife's constant unspoken responsibilities. The concealment of dishonour also carried a collective element. In many villages, women supported one another by sharing strategies for deflecting suspicion. A neighbour might vouch for a girl's whereabouts if questioned, or agree to keep silent about an illicit trade. In turn, she might expect the same protection when her own family's reputation was at risk. This mutual aid reinforced the idea that honour was not an absolute truth, but a negotiated perception, one that could be maintained through collective discretion. Yet this constant need for concealment came with its own costs. Women carried the weight of secrecy heavily, knowing that a single slip of the tongue could undo years of careful management. Honour was fragile, and once broken, it could be difficult to repair. Families marked by scandal often found themselves excluded from alliances, marriages and trade opportunities, consequences that could affect generations. Thus, women's hidden labour of concealment was not just about the present moment, it was about preserving the family's place in the long arc of village life. In this way, honour was less about truth than about stability. Housewives did not necessarily see themselves as deceivers, rather they saw their efforts as necessary acts of protection. What was concealed kept the household intact. What was whispered or displayed with care ensured that daughters could marry, sons could trade, and families could endure. And so, generation after generation, women passed down not only practical skills, but also the unspoken duty of guarding honour through silence, discretion, and carefully chosen words. Many medieval women carried burdens of secrecy so heavy that they were never spoken aloud, not even to those closest to them. These were the kinds of truths that could damage a family's standing, disrupt village life, or invite the harsh judgment of the church. And so, rather than risk exposure, they were locked away in silence, carried quietly until the grave closed over them. The nature of these secrets varied widely. Some were deeply personal, an affair never confessed, a child's true paternity known only to its mother, or an act of quiet defiance that might have been judged harshly if revealed. Others were practical matters that, if admitted, could bring ruin. A wife who skimmed a little from her husband's earnings to create a hidden store of coins might never tell him, even on her deathbed. A woman who had pawned a family heirloom to feed her children might have hoped it would be forgotten once life carried on. These decisions, unspoken in life, became truths that vanished with the women who held them. Deathbed confessions were encouraged by priests who saw them as essential to saving the soul. But confession was also a risk, for priests were still men of the community, bound to the same networks of gossip and suspicion as everyone else. A wife who feared tarnishing her family's reputation might carefully edit her final words, admitting to small sins, but never touching the deeper ones. In this way, silence was chosen even when eternity was at stake. It was not that women did not fear God's judgment, many did, but the immediate damage to their children, husbands, or kin weighed heavily enough to keep certain truths unspoken. There were also secrets shaped by fear of punishment. In times when accusations of heresy or witchcraft could lead to trial or worse, women were cautious about revealing too much of what they knew or practiced. A mother might have brewed remedies or charms that skirted the edge of suspicion, but she would not record them, and she might not even pass them on. Instead, she allowed them to die with her, trusting that silence was the safest path. In such cases, knowledge itself was buried alongside the body, ensuring safety, but also erasing small, fragile traditions. Even within families, secrecy endured. Husbands and wives might share a lifetime together, raising children and enduring hardship, but some matters remained untouchable. A wife might never reveal how she truly felt about her marriage, or the sacrifices she made to keep the household running. These unspoken experiences formed part of the hidden history of medieval domestic life, shaping families in ways that could not always be traced because they left no record but silence. The community, too, respected the boundary between what was known and what was never to be spoken. Villages often held suspicions about certain families or individuals, but without proof, the suspicions remained whispers rather than open accusations. Death could seal a matter in permanent uncertainty, allowing households to move forward without ever addressing the truth. In this sense, the grave was both an end and a protection. Once a person was gone, the weight of their secrets could no longer erupt into scandal. This pattern of concealment reveals the extraordinary pressure women carried to manage not just their own reputations, but those of their families. The fear of what might happen if a secret escaped was often more powerful than the relief of speaking it aloud. And because women were expected to guard the honour of their households, silence became part of their duty. Secrets were woven into their daily lives so tightly that even the final threshold of death could not undo the habit of restraint. For historians, this creates a particular challenge. Chronicles, court records, and sermons capture the scandals that came to light, but they cannot show us the much larger world of secrets that never emerged. The quiet manipulations, the hidden choices, the silent resistances, all of these shaped medieval life as much as open acts of power and defiance. Yet they are largely invisible, because they were carried away by women who chose not to speak. And so the story of medieval housewives is not only one of labour, resilience and adaptation, but also of silence. Some of their greatest acts of endurance lay not in what they did openly, but in what they concealed so thoroughly that even history struggles to uncover it. Their graves held not only their bodies, but also the untold truths of households, families and villages. In this way, secrecy itself became an inheritance, not in words passed down, but in the careful, enduring practice of guarding honour, even at life's end. When we consider the many silences that medieval housewives carried to their graves, it becomes clear that these whispers, half-spoken, often hidden and rarely recorded, still matter in how we understand the past. For historians, they represent the vast invisible layer of women's experiences that official documents largely ignore. Chronicles were written by monks, legal codes by clerics, and property records by men of authority. But the quiet negotiations of women in kitchens, bedrooms and market stalls are harder to trace. Yet these whispers, though faint, still shaped households, influenced communities, and altered the lives of future generations. One of the reasons these voices matter is that they expose the gap between official history and lived reality. The church preached obedience, law courts enforced hierarchy, and sermons idealised the submissive wife. But the daily practices of women tell a different story, one of hidden bargains, quiet resistance, and subtle survival strategies. The fact that many of these remained unspoken does not mean they were unimportant. On the contrary, they were the foundations upon which families endured hunger, illness, and conflict. By looking closely at what was concealed, we get a fuller picture of how medieval society actually functioned. Whispers also highlight the role of women as transmitters of knowledge. Even when secrets died with an individual, many others were passed down quietly from mother to daughter or between neighbours in hushed conversations. These might have been recipes for herbal salves, advice on navigating a difficult husband, or warnings about who in the village could be trusted. Though unrecorded, such exchanges formed a network of survival knowledge that kept communities functioning. The persistence of these traditions across centuries, sometimes resurfacing in folk medicine or household customs, shows how powerful women's informal authority could be. Another reason these whispers matter is that they reveal the costs of silence. Fear of exposure meant that women often bore burdens alone, without the relief of confession or the chance to defend themselves. By studying these patterns, we better understand the pressures of gender and hierarchy in medieval Europe. It was not simply that women were voiceless, rather their voices operated in a parallel system, spoken softly, coded in rumour, or confined to trusted spaces. Recognising this dual system of communication allows us to appreciate how women navigated the limits placed upon them. There is also a direct link between medieval whispers and modern discussions of hidden labour. Many of the unspoken roles of medieval housewives, organising households, mediating disputes, managing small trades and transmitting cultural values, still resonate today. Domestic labour, whether in the 14th century or the 21st, often goes unacknowledged because it is performed quietly behind closed doors. By acknowledging the significance of medieval women's whispers, we place value on the hidden contributions that continue to sustain families and communities across time. Whispers matter too, because they complicate our understanding of power. It is tempting to view history as the story of kings, lords, and bishops. But power also resided in those subtle spaces where housewives whispered to one another. A rumour could damage a man's reputation more effectively than an official edict. A carefully withheld secret could protect a family from scandal. The decision to remain silent could prevent violence or ensure survival. These choices were small in scale, but they reveal how women exercised influence in ways not captured by parchment records or monumental laws. Finally, the study of whispers challenges us to listen differently. Instead of looking only at what was written, we must pay attention to gaps, silences, and traces in the historical record. A fine imposed on a woman for selling ale without a license hints at a larger story of hidden markets. A priest's warning against gossip suggests that women's voices carried more weight than the church preferred. These fragments remind us that the past is not only made up of what was said openly, but also of what was concealed, half-spoken or never written down. In this way, the whispers of medieval housewives are not just echoes of the past. They are reminders of the resilience and resourcefulness of women who lived within strict boundaries, but still managed to shape their worlds. Their silence was not emptiness, but a form of strategy, a way of balancing survival with dignity. By paying attention to these hidden histories, we honour the lives of those who left little behind, but whose quiet strength influenced families, communities, and traditions for centuries. The grave may have closed over many of their secrets, but the whispers linger, carried forward in the patterns of domestic life, the persistence of oral knowledge, and the very structure of households that relied on women's invisible labour. To study them is to recognise that history is not only about battles and rulers, it is also about the careful, hushed words exchanged at the hearth. And those whispers, though faint, still matter today. As we leave behind the narrow lanes and smoky hearths of medieval Europe, it is worth pausing to consider what we have uncovered. This has not been a story of queens and saints, nor of crusades and castles. Instead, has been a journey into kitchens, back rooms and gardens, spaces where women lived most of their lives and where their quietest decisions left the deepest impressions. We began behind closed doors, noticing how housewives carved out moments of privacy even in cramped homes where eyes and ears were everywhere. Privacy was not guaranteed. It had to be claimed, protected or invented. From there, we followed the threads of forbidden knowledge. As women kept alive traditions of herbs and remedies, recipes whispered across generations and healing practices that were both necessary and risky. Their knowledge sustained families, but could just as easily be turned into an accusation of witchcraft or heresy. We then stepped into the charged terrain of love and loyalty, where women balanced arranged marriages with the tug of secret desires. Affairs, friendships, and emotional bonds outside formal unions carried dangers, but also revealed that women were not silent pawns. They were human, with needs that could not always be contained by the rules of church or community. Gossip emerged here as both protection and peril, a tool to defend oneself, but also a weapon that could ruin a reputation. Money, too, told its secrets. Housewives were not passive dependents, but active participants in hidden economies. They sold ale, bartered cloth, lent coins, and sometimes out-earned their husbands. These small trades and quiet deals shaped the survival of households and sometimes shifted the balance of power inside marriages. It was in these negotiations that obedience became a mask behind which freedom could be quietly claimed. Household power extended further into child-rearing and the running of homes. Here, women's choices, often unspoken, determined discipline, diet, and values. Silence became a tool, sometimes sharper than open rebellion. Even in something as ordinary as washing linens or preparing meals, women wielded control, embedding acts of resistance in the fabric of daily life. Hygiene, often overlooked in great histories, revealed more secrets. Women bore the responsibility of masking smells, controlling lice, and maintaining basic cleanliness in environments where disease was constant. These efforts, while rarely spoken of, represented another sphere where women's labour and ingenuity kept families alive. The quiet rituals of washing and fumigation were not glamorous, but they mattered. In the realm of whispers, gossip, and information networks formed a hidden web of power. Housewives became keepers of village secrets, weighing what to reveal and what to hold back. Their words could protect or endanger, and their silence often carried as much weight as their speech. Information was a form of currency as valuable as money or food. Religion, too, unfolded behind closed doors. Women prayed privately, kept hidden relics, and sometimes bent the boundaries of piety. Their faith was real, but it was also personal, shaped by the needs of the household more than the dictates of priests. At times, this blurred line between devotion and heresy created risks, yet it also gave women a quiet spiritual authority within their families. In the darker corners of desperation, we saw how survival could turn to crime. Housewives wielded household tools as weapons, committed small thefts or frauds, and in rare but chilling cases resorted to poison. These acts were born not of malice, but of necessity, revealing the crushing pressures of a world where women had little room to maneuver. Finally, we traced how these whispers carried across generations. Daughters learned traditions, silences, and survival skills from their mothers. Family honour dictated what was hidden, what was spoken, and what went to the grave. And though the details often faded, the patterns endured, shaping the lives of women for centuries after. Looking back across these chapters, what emerges is not just a catalogue of secrets, but a portrait of quiet resilience. Medieval housewives were not powerless, even if their influence rarely appeared in chronicles or laws. Their strength lay in negotiation, concealment, and the ability to keep families afloat under immense pressure. They shaped economies, carried knowledge, and mediated between faith and survival. They resisted when they could, endured when they had to, and in all of it, they left behind a legacy written not in ink, but in whispers. And so, as we close the book on these dangerous secrets, it is worth remembering that history is not only the story of kings, wars, and proclamations. It is also the story of unspoken words, quiet decisions, and the countless unseen acts that held communities together. The whispers of medieval housewives remind us that even in silence there is power, and that sometimes the smallest voices shape the largest truths. Let that thought linger with you now, soft as the last embers of a hearth at night. The house grows quiet, the doors are shut, and the secrets remain, still alive, still shaping how we remember. Good night.